Jack Loeffler is an American oral historian, radio producer, writer, and environmentalist. He is known for his work in documenting the culture and ecology of the American Southwest. Can you tell us a bit about your background and how you first became interested in the intersection of culture, ecology, consciousness, and sound?
That's a big issue. Basically, it didn't all happen at once, mind you, but I had always loved being outside. I was born in Parkersburg, West Virginia in 1936, back in a totally different cultural zone in the United States. Ed Abbey, by the way, was born in Indiana, Pennsylvania, in 1927. So we were both sort of in the hillbilly mode of America. And the paradise of my childhood was Marietta, Ohio. It was a very beautiful rural town. In those days, over 50% of people in America lived in rural countryside, whereas today less than 20% do, which is really tremendous. But the upshot is that I spent a lot of time outside. I was happier outside than anything else. And let me think here. I got drafted. I dropped out of college in 1956 because I wasn't doing anything I wanted to do. And so I decided I wanted to do my way through life. So I've subsequently basically bushwhacked my own way through life. But in the Army, as a jazz musician drafted into the United States Army, I played jazz back in those days, but I played in a military band. And I have to say this, thinking back on it, first I was stationed up in Fort Lewis, Washington, after I got out of basic training at Fort Benning. And I remember one day, but this is back in 1957.
Okay. So slightly post-World War II?
Yeah, it was 12 years, 57. The war ended in 45 with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I listened to on the radio, by the way, at the age of 9. But anyway, in Fort Lewis, 12 years later, this is also after the Korean War, I one day was sitting out on the shores of Puget Sound and was reading The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley.
So you read, going back, Doors of Perception, Alex Huxley, that must have just been published.
Well, not that much earlier. I had been reading Huxley. He was truly one of my favorite writers. I actually met him in Mill Valley, I think it was, shortly before his death. And, well, this brings up a whole other thing. After I got out of the Army, I went to North Beach in San Francisco, and the beat scene was just coming on in those days, and I really related to that. And over time, I actually got to know a fair number of the beat poets who did an historic reading at the Sixth Gallery in 1955, which was the genesis of the West Coast literary renaissance. And it was put together, well, my friend Philip Whalen was one of the great poets who read there. And Philip remained a great friend till he passed away 20 or so years ago. But at any rate, the 5 poets were Allen Ginsberg, Philip Whalen, Philip Lamantia, Mike McClure, and Gary Snyder. And Gary remains a close friend to this day. Gary's 93, and in our emails, it's largely geriatric at this point. But we've been pals for a very long time.
Yeah, that's friendship that goes back a long way with, poets that have a strong legacy. Gary especially, I feel like is a common name in outdoor environmental writing.
Well, he's one of the greatest.
Yeah, he's up there.
We actually, he gave me some poems to put in that Clear Creek magazine there.
Oh, nice.
But the upshot is that being a jazz musician, it worked very well for me to be in North Beach for a bit. Mm-hmm. And then I went back briefly to Ohio to see if I wanted to go back to school, which I did for one trimester at Ohio State, and it still didn't work for me. And so, but while I was in the Army, and this is a biggie for me, I was stationed in what was then known as Camp Irwin, California. I got there in early July 1957 from Fort Lewis, Washington. And the very first gig our military band attended was at the Nevada Proving Grounds, and one morning before dawn, we were out there in band formation playing Sousa marches, and they shot off an A-bomb 7 miles away.
Oh my gosh.
And that totally blew my mind to the extent that I thought about not just what the bomb does to fellow humans as it had done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but what it does to habitat. Mm-hmm. And that was a key moment. That was an epiphanistic moment for me. And from that day onward, I've been deeply involved one way or another in thoughts of how to protect habitat in any conceivable fashion you can imagine. Mm-hmm. I mean, that bomb took out all the biota in the immediate region of the detonation. And then I saw another one go off, and a few weeks later.
Oh my gosh.
And that sort of ratified the concept for me. And subsequently, I've been in my own head very much involved in environmental protection right down the line. And so that's, gee whiz, it's closing in on 70 years of it. And so I did what I could do just as an individual, off and on. The first time I engaged with other people was when Walter Chappelle and Alan Lober and I, all at that point in Santa Fe, tried to stop the detonation of subterranean atomic bombs in the south end of the Jicarilla Ranger District of the Carson National Forest in New Mexico in order to ostensibly create heat-sealed caves.
I had no idea that ever even happened.
It did. It happened in 66 or 5, one of those years. And obviously the gas was too hot, too radioactive to use, but they didn't extrapolate that ahead of time, and I realized that bureaucratic procedure is the reason I left the university. I wanted to think in a different way. I didn't want to think linearly. And but we were totally unsuccessful. I tried to get Dave Brower involved in that, but he couldn't get into that. I regard him as probably the great environmentalist of the 20th century. And he also became a close friend. We had some good adventures together. One night we camped at the base of Ship Rock, and he showed me the route that he'd hiked up it in 1937, I think it was, when he was in his 20s. He was the first guy to the top of it as far as is known. But anyway, all of these things, seeing desert country, coming to the Southwest, that's when I first came to the Southwest, was July of 1957. And it became my homeland, my rangeland, so to speak. And I gradually became native to this place, but all over it. There's an Hispano term, querencia, which means the place where your soul belongs, the physical place on the planet, but it's movable. And for me, that's the entire North American Southwest, which includes northwestern Mexico, and all the way over to the Chihuahuan Desert I've explored all of these deserts and even the mountain ranges of the Sierra Madre Occidental. I've had a great life. Yeah. I've had a lot of fun, I'll tell you.
That's a lot.
And so that's how the bomb kicked it off. And way back then, in one way or the other, I've been into it ever since. There were colors that don't otherwise appear in nature that I saw in those blasts.
Yeah, I can't imagine the radiation. And they just hadn't, they didn't know they were playing with fire.
Well, that's one reason why I was a late comer to parenthood. My daughter's 42. I was 44 or 5 when she was born, because I was convinced that the radiation had, and so I went to a geneticist when my wife got pregnant. We did, and the geneticist said the chances are slight. And so, in a joking fashion, I figured, well, 2 heads are better than 1.
I'm glad it worked out for you. You're able to have a daughter and grow your
She's
family.
great.
Yeah. Okay, my next question. What was your process in choosing to write your latest book, A Pagan Polemic, right?
Polemic.
Sorry about that. A Pagan Polemic. Reflections on nature, consciousness, and anarchism.
Well, many of the essays in this book have been previously published. At the time I put this book together, I did write some fresh stuff for it, I must say, but my wife was ill with a terminal disease, and I was her full-time caregiver, because she not only was my wife, but she was my super pal as well. And but I needed a project at the same time, and so this book was that project, and it gave me really a lot of time to reflect on the nature of my own life and the way I've seen things, and the fact that I've spent so much of my life in the presence of indigenous peoples all over the western United States, and well, actually as far south as Chiapas in Mexico, and befriended so many of them. They became lifelong friends and would open up to me when I'd conduct interviews with them, being an oral historian. I spell that A-U-R-A-L. I like it better because it's more realistic to me. But the upshot is, many of those people, the traditional peoples that I met who were indeed, they retained their sense of indigeneity. They were traditional, they maintained deep ties with their traditions, and subsequently their thinking was much more closely aligned with the relationship, a correct relationship of culture to habitat. And so I got deeply into thinking about a lot of the different things to put into this book. And I started going through essays that I'd written, dozens and dozens of essays that I'd already written. And I selected a bunch that I thought reflected the perspective that I wanted to reflect. And the title, A Pagan Polemic, my pal Gary Snyder was not keen on that name because the word pagan comes basically from a European paganistic perspective, pre-Christian, all of that. But I realize that I am rooted originally in European influence, and the paganism seems to come naturally to me, and it associates all so nicely with just about every traditional indigenous perspective that I've ever encountered. In other words, love of the earth, then becoming totally what I think of as naturalized or naturized. And so that's where the pagan part of it came in. And then being something of a polemicist, somebody who runs counter to the cultural continuum, so to speak, was why the word polemic became a part of it. And not only that, it's nice alliteration. But I focus many of the essays that I've written focus on nature and the flow of nature, and how, to me, the most important thing we can do is daily go skinny dipping in the flow of nature, basically. And I've always been fascinated by the nature of consciousness and how do we perceive. And one of the things I talk about a lot in this book actually came from having first read an essay by Garrett Hardin entitled Tragedy of the Commons, which was first published in 1968. And in 1984, near Christmas time in 1984, the Abbeys and the Loefflers always went camping around the holiday season. And Ned and I were taking a hike one day, and he said, "Have you ever read anything by Garrett Hardin?" And I said, "Yeah, The Tragedy of the Commons." And he gave me an essay that he had just read, that Hardin had just published in Scientific American, titled An Ecolate View of the Human Predicament, which I snapped to instantly.
Let me slow down real quick and just speak to Tragedy of the Commons, because and give a little more context on that, in case folks watching this haven't read it. Going off my memory, I read it. It had a big impact on me. I read it in an environmental policy class, let's just say 15 years ago, a little more. And his thesis is that if there's a common area, the humans will overtake it in a way that makes it so that landscape is no longer viable, and that's the tragedy. He has an essay that speaks to that much more eloquently than I just laid out, but I feel like that's the nuts and bolts of it. But it sets the stage for the separation between, anthropocentric thinking, just thinking, okay, what's best for me, and more ecocentric thinking, what's best for the environment, and
exactly.
how can I be a part of that. And without that framework, it's hard to have these kind of discussions or do this type of work.
Well, I read The Ecolate View of the Human Predicament in Ed's Scientific American. And it turned out that a couple of weeks later, my wife and my daughter and I found ourselves in 1984 out in Santa Barbara. And I knew that's where he had taught. And so I looked him up in the phone book, and he was there. And of course, I always traveled with the recording equipment.
Right.
I'm going to cough, excuse me.
No, you're fine.
And okay, boys, come back. Excuse me. This could be tricky.
Yeah, we can cut that piece out. So the power of editing, you'll be fine.
Yeah, I know. It's good stuff. Anyway, I called him up, and he answered the phone. And I said, "My name is Jack Loeffler. I'm a friend of Ed Abbey, whom you've been in contact with." Ed and Garrett had corresponded frequently. They were part of a fan club, a mutual fan club. And I said, "I'd like to conduct an interview with you if you're amenable." And he said, "That's fine." And I said, "When?" And he said, "Now." And so I found myself driving from Santa Barbara to Goleta, which is where he lived, which is right there where UC Santa Barbara is. And I was driving with one hand and speed reading An Ecolate View of the Human Predicament with the other.
Brush up on it.
Whew. And I got there safely. I didn't kill anybody. And I set up and got a beautiful interview with Garrett Hardin. And he really described, first of all, I asked him to convey the basic concept that he wanted to develop in the tragedy of the commons. And the way he put it to me was that in England of 200 or 300 years ago, there was a common area of grassland, and the people who lived around it were using it as a common pasture land. And indeed, it became evident that putting too many more cattle on it was going to kill the pasture land. But they did anyway, and indeed that commons was no longer capable of supporting anything. And according to Hardin, the tragedy of the commons was they knew it was going to happen, but they did it anyway. And that's in his own words, which I recorded. That entire interview is in an early book I did called Headed Upstream, Interviews with Iconoclasts. And matter of fact, I've got that whole recording. I can give you some of the quotes in there. Another thing that he came up with on that interview, come to think of it, was he quoted William Ophuls, who's still around as far as I know, whom he had great respect for personally. Hardin did. But the quote is, "Nature abhors a maximum." In other words, if you maximize your extraction of natural resources to fulfill growth for the sake of growth, you will have minimized the habitat to the extent that it will. In other words, it was the same trip. The tragedy of the commons. And I really liked Garrett Hardin. He became a friend. When I'd go through Santa Barbara to visit in-laws, I would take strawberries or something out and we'd shoot the breeze. But he was paralyzed from the waist down. He'd had polio. And but I really enjoyed talking to him. His brain just was amazing.
Yeah. He's a deep thinker and really a profound environmental writer.
I've forgotten the question, by the way.
Well, his philosophy just really set the stage.
Yeah. Where I wanted to go with that is that I see the entire planet as a commons. And it's an integrated system, and it's, to me, a living organism. And apropos of that, when I was speaking with Wes Jackson some years ago, Wes Jackson is another brilliant guy. He started the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and a brilliant ecologist. He really is. But I told him that I considered the planet a living organism. And he says, well, it fails in one respect, and that is that it can't reproduce itself. And living organisms are capable of reproduction, self-reproduction. And I said, yeah, but that's a human definition.
Right.
You know, and so we have to take that in.
more philosophical.
Yeah, and subsequently I've read stuff by people like Fritjof Capra, his book, it's over there, and I can't remember the name of it right now. And then the work of Lynn Margulis, whose work with symbiosis is just so brilliant to me. And she's gone now. Fritjof is still around. I interviewed him, but the upshot is that trying to put the whole thing together, I finally realized that human consciousness is itself a commons, and so that's why I included the whole thinking about consciousness in this book. And then I got to thinking about anarchism. Both Ed Abbey and Gary Snyder, and myself and others are anarchists. I'm very much a benign one. I do not intend to ever hurt anybody over any subject except self-defense or defense of family. But
Right.
The upshot is that I feel that governance from the top down is dead wrong. It's got to come from the grassroots and come up. And it has to be, in other words, governance should be by consensus within small communities. And so I was thinking about, to me, what reflects an obvious biotic community is an ecosystem like a watershed. And so my thought with regard to governance and all of that has to do with looking at watersheds as John Wesley Powell did back in the latter part of the 19th century. He influenced me big time. But the upshot is that if grassroots governance from within the watersheds rather than the geopolitically bounded states that we have came to prevail, that would make a lot more sense. This does not mean that there shouldn't be some form of different levels of governance. Subsequently, my daughter Peregrina and I interviewed a lady named Eleanor Ostrom back in 2010, who'd recently gotten the Nobel Prize for her book, Governing the Commons. Yep. She, by the way, took some umbrage with Garrett Hardin because never in any of his writing did he bring up the word trust or mutual cooperation, which was interesting to me. And that brought up something else to me because my great anarchist thinker to me remains Peter Kropotkin, who was also, the term hadn't been coined yet, but a dynamite biogeographer. He really was. I mean, he was a huge scientist, a fantastic scientist, but he was also a committed anarchist, and his particular thinking was formulated before the human population actually reached 1 billion. And he was thinking about people being the difference between the governing bodies and the serfs who served the governing bodies, the slaves, the people in the fields who produced for the
our lords and peasants. Sorry.
Exactly. And so that's where he came from. And then it was easy to just transpose that thinking into thinking about not just people, but the planet should sit at the table of any governing body. The point of view of the planet is interpreted by people who are well enough educated to the needs of the planet to speak in its behalf relative to individual watersheds, because each watershed has its own needs. And watershed consciousness has become terrifically important to me. And so that's how I got to the title of the book, A Pagan Polemic, Reflections on Nature, Consciousness, and Anarchism, because it all fits together, at least in my head.
Puts those puzzle pieces together. That's great. Your work often involves oral history and ethnomusicology. How do you believe sound and music contribute to our understanding of culture and the environment?
Well, that's an interesting thought to me. I mean, the first time I turned on a tape recorder, this is back in the days of analog, was in 1957 or 8 when I was in the Army Band, and I had a jazz quintet there. And a major came along one day who was an amateur songwriter and asked me to get my quintet together and play a piece of music. And so I did, and I borrowed a tape recorder, and I thought, this is incredible. What a tool. And so from then on, as soon as I could, I started getting recorders, tape recorders, and they weren't always the best, but they were the best I could get. And then in 73, I was able to buy a Nagra stereo tape recorder, which was the best you could get, and really good mics. And from that point on, that's the way I started making my living. It was after we had finally closed the doors to the Black Mesa Defense Fund, which I'd founded with Jimmy Hopper and Bill Brown in 1970, 12 days before the first Earth Day, which is interesting.
So going back to the, you happen to across this piece of technology to record a song, tape recorder. I'm curious though, and so that became your method of choice for storytelling for a long time. And even a lot of your written work that I've read, like you're transcribing from stories of recordings and interviews. Did it just like naturally jive with you more, I guess, than writing?
Yeah, I had not intended ever to be a writer, or if I had, it was to write poems or whatever, and keep a journal, which I've done for a long time. There are a lot of different ways to answer that question. Back in 1964, I had always had an enduring interest in indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. And does the name Stuart Brand ring a bell with you?
No, but I'm not as well.
Well, Stuart he did the Whole Earth Catalog back in the 1970s. Right. But he and I were good pals way back, starting in 1960. Mm-hmm. And he invited me to participate in a project that he put together called America Needs Indians in 1964. And I had a recorder with me that worked part of the time. It was just a funky little recorder in those days and a camera. But I ended up living with my first wife in a fork stick hogan at Navajo Mountain, Utah for half a year. And ostensibly to record their thinking or whatever and take their photographs, but I was way too shy to really do a good job of that and didn't do much of any of that. But I did get deeply into hanging with these people. I was adopted into a family of Navajos, and I herded sheep, and I protected the cornfield and did all sorts of stuff. I had a pickup truck, one of 3 motorized vehicles in the whole region. Subsequently, it became sort of a taxi service. And, but for example, I helped haul water, in big 30-gallon cans. A 30-gallon can in those days was exactly as much as I could lift on or lift off the back of my pickup truck. Yeah, it's
8 pounds a gallon.
Yeah, it's 240 gallons. Yeah. And but the upshot is that I really snapped to how much habitat shapes cultural perspective. Mm-hmm. That was the beginning of that for me. And the sounds of habitat. I attended a couple of ceremonials up there. The first part of a squaw dance, or the Enemy Way ceremony, was a mind blower to me. Basically, it was just them living in a state of utter reciprocity with their homeland. And nobody spoke English except this one 12-year-old boy. He was 12 in 64, so he was born in 52. But the upshot is that from that point on, I still continued working with America Needs Indians. Stuart took it in a different direction for his perspective, and it actually sort of prefaced the Whole Earth Catalog, because concurrently happening with that was the advent of counterculture spreading out of Greenwich Village and out of North Beach and coming to the Southwest, which was also a very big perspective for me. But the upshot is that as time went on, I was always with a recorder. I worked briefly, for 3 or 4 years with the museum system in Santa Fe, Museum of New Mexico. And I had a recorder, and I started producing soundtracks at that point for museum exhibitions. That was fun. And then we did the Black Mesa Defense Fund, and I had access to a recorder and would do sound. We put together AV presentations. I remember one time Does the name Godfrey Reggio ring a bell with you?
No.
Coglione Scazzi, the Scazzi trilogy of films.
Oh, yes, a little bit.
Yeah, they're very far out. But I got him to read the narration, which was actually a poem by Gary Snyder that he'd sent me. Anasazi was the name of the poem. And that was fun, but I won't even go into that. But the upshot is it kept becoming more and more apparent to me that hearing, at least to me, is the most deeply penetrating of the five senses. Sight, of course, is just, you can't do without it unless you don't have it. And then I started doing some research, and people like Walter Ong, who really got into the whole business of orality, so to speak, came up with the same concept, that it really is the most deeply penetrating. It results in the explosion of intellect and just all manner of consciousness. And so, in 1973, I was able to figure out a way to raise some money legally to pay off the debts of the Black Mesa Defense Fund and buy myself the Nagra, and also to buy a piece of land in Santa Fe and have enough left over so that my wife and I, with our own hands, build our own house. And so that set me up, and I started recording. And I learned how to write grant proposals.
There you go.
And I wrote proposals and started getting grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, administered through the New Mexico Arts people, to record Hispano folk music and archive it. And I got into that in a big way. They too have established a sense of indigeneity in the Rio Grande watershed after 20 generations. The first people got there in 1590 something, 8, 7. And so 20 generations of Hispano culture, which is unique. It's not the same as Mexican culture, because I've spent a lot of time there too. It's unique, and it has achieved, there's a term mestizaje, which is Spanish for mixture, and it's the mixture of bloodline and cultural perspective with the Puebloan Indians, many of them. And it's a beautiful culture, and I recorded somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Hispano folk songs, a huge collection. And I made 149 30-minute radio programs, which were broadcast regionally, called La Música de los Viejitos. I'm no longer a jazz player. I quit about 1990, because it takes a lot out of you. I mean, going for a high note, I had this vision of going for a high F and having an aneurysm and die.
It takes that much.
But sound has always been central to my life, music. And so I got really into it, and the more I got into it with the Hispano culture, the more I realized that their music really, a lot of their music, not all of it, is connected to habitat. And actually I included in the thumb drive I'm going to give you an indita, which is a musical form. I was able to identify maybe 50 different musical forms in Hispano folk music going back in time. I mean, I'd recorded songs that people were singing when they came up the Rio Grande back a long time ago. And
would you be open to letting me use some of those recordings as like the soundscape for this project I'm working on?
Sure.
Yeah.
There's one, Indita del Rio Grande, that's got components of both Native American music and Hispano music in it, but it sings about the Rio Grande and just all of the goodie that goes along with that.
Wow.
And it was written by my friend Chuy Martinez, performed by him. And Chuy got himself across the river when he was 8 years old from Mexico.
Okay.
And he was gifted musically.
Mm-hmm.
And he became part of the conjunto that traveled with Cesar Chavez.
Oh, wow. So was he based in
California for a while.
Yeah, San Luis Valley. That's
Yeah.
very close, that's close to San Jose, where I'm at.
And his
basically.
and Dolores Huerta, do you know her?
Uh-uh.
She and Cesar
Okay.
worked together, and I spent a day with her. Boy, what a great lady she is at one
Yeah.
point. But at any rate, it's a gradual procedure, and it's, to me, I've never been linear. It's always been, earlier on, I had a vision of the necessity for pulling nails out of my frame of reference
Mm-hmm.
and letting it become a sphere of reference so that it was multidimensional, really multidimensional. Actually, recently I came to the conclusion that consciousness itself is a dimension,
Mm-hmm.
which is a thought. But at any rate, so I recorded all of those songs, and in order to get the grant, I had to put it back. And the way I thought best to put it back was on public radio stations.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was broadcast throughout New Mexico and southern Colorado and wherever Hispano culture was.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went. I'd always been deeply interested in Native American culture. And I had, starting way back in 1960 or 61, I ate peyote in a teepee where there were 5 different Indian cultures at the same time. And I realized that each one of those cultural perspectives was complete, but seeing them all come together in a peyote ceremony, Native American church ceremony, was very profound. And so,
Were you in your 30s in the early 1960s or late 20s? How old were you when you?
I was in 1960. I would have been 24,
24. Okay. So.
and I'd been smoking pot for several years.
Okay.
I started smoking pot when I was in the Army
Oh wow.
as a jazz musician.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The dealer came by one day and said, "Hey man, you got to read this."
Oh right.
And I looked at it, and it was Howl by Allen Ginsberg.
Oh wow. It's just also a time like kids these days, like the prohibition's over,
Yeah.
At least in most states.
Yeah, well, it's what I think about then is I don't smoke pot anymore for the big reason is that I want to continue to screw up my lungs, but
Yeah.
it's no fun anymore because you're not an outlaw.
Right. You're not an outlaw for sure. So going back to this, was that your first, what I would say, hallucinogenic experience? I mean, and
Well, it was the first time I got high on an hallucinogen. No, the first time was before that.
Okay.
Was also peyote. Peyote's been I don't take it anymore. I haven't taken it in probably over 50 years, but
It's the opposite of addictive.
yeah.
I know. I'll generalize and say hallucinogens in general. I personally haven't done peyote, but play around with mushrooms, and it's very opposite of addictive. So
Yeah.
doing what you're like, I don't need to go back there for a while.
Yeah, no, I took it. I decided the last time I took it that I'm going to take it with me,
Yeah.
keep that headset as best I can, and I been pretty successful with it. But the upshot is that was the first time I really got into it with Native Americans, and I wanted to continue the process, and so I somehow, I can't remember when I first started recording them, but my great friend Rena Swensel, who was born into the Tewa Pueblo of Santa Clara, north of Santa Fe, south of Española, called me up one day in the 1980s and asked me if I could record her mother singing Tewa children's songs.
Mm-hmm.
And I was blown away to be invited by a Native American to record music, because that's not something that normally happens. I have a good friend named Tony Isaacs in Taos, I hope he's still alive, who had a recording company, Rainbow Cassettes, and he recorded a lot of Native American people all over the place, while I was recording Hispano people all over the place. And but I had never really recorded Native Americans. And so when I went out there, I started recording. Well, first of all, I was so undone by having been invited to go record in a pueblo, which is totally verboten, and I did. And Rena, who was at that time married to a man named Ralph Swansel, who was a tutor at St. John's College in Santa Fe, beautiful. He was a really neat guy. I met him and knew him, but he died of cancer. And that was a sad thing, because she lost her grandson skiing into a tree, her mom, whom I recorded, and her husband the same year. But Rena became like a sister, really close friend. Her photograph is in that book.
So it sounds like you went on this, you get invited to record Native American culture, and then it goes deeper than that. You become you establish.
Well, people trusted me.
Yeah. Because
I never used it in any way that shouldn't be used. And boy, when I think about all of the people that I recorded, great friends, many of them gone now, but people knew that I wouldn't misuse it, that I would always. I told them that I wanted to put it on the radio because my thinking is that if I can get their perspectives in their own words out where people can hear them, it will invigorate a new level of consciousness in our culture, which is stuck in an economically dominated paradigm. And they weren't. And boy, Rena was right on, right down the line. And so I started recording different peoples. For some reason, people in the folklore community wanted me to do occasional seminars on how you do it. And so I did. And more and more, that led to people asking me if I would come do a project in their area. So I spent 4 months doing a whole project in the Sonoran Desert, which fascinates me. And I have a friend there whose picture's in this book.
Like Cabeza Prieta area? Or?
And east of there. Well, I mean, actually, I recorded right up against it.
Organ pipe?
Well, I did an organ pipe. I did a project there with the Park Service. My friend Bruce Hucko shot the photographs, and I did this.
You just every place I've named in this landscape, it sounds like you've recorded it.
Yeah, I've camped a lot out in the Cabeza, and I'm all over at age 87, when you're fascinated by a huge region, you get a chance to spend
you spend some time.
A lot of time out in it. And but recording, then I started recording habitat. And then I discovered MS recording, which is really cool, which is mid-side recording, which I will describe right this minute. The top microphone, they're in a configuration like this. The top microphone is a cardioid, directional mic. The one beneath it is a figure of 8. So that the figure of 8 is going into the right channel on your recorder, the cardioid on the left, and then you put it into your editing system, in my case Pro Tools. Then you duplicate the second channel, throw the duplicated channel out of phase with the other channel, and then you spread them apart. In other words, you're working with 3 channels in your editing system, and you can either zoom in on a given bird, or you can back off and bring up the habitat where the bird is singing.
Yeah.
And that is beautiful.
Man.
And
See that technology evolve.
Yeah, and the evolution of tech, it blows me away. But I also I can't tell you how many concerts of chamber music I've recorded, and choral music, and CDs of it and stuff. It's really, I love sound, and working with sound has been really wonderful, right down the line. I mean, I've recorded everything I could think of to record, but for example, with regard to how it relates to habitat, my friends Gary Nabhan and Lori Monty. Gary Nabhan, you may be familiar with his work. He's a world-class ethnobotanist for one thing, and got a MacArthur Award way back when to do his work. But he and Lori and I have spent a lot of time together down in Seri Indian country in Sonora. And they especially, I've gone along to record, and then I taught Lori how to record, and so she's gone on to really do it. But actually, she ended up getting her PhD in ethnoecology or ecoethnology or some such. But at any rate, one day I was recording my friend, a Seri Indian man named Jesus Rojo Montaño. And he spoke no English, but he did speak some Spanish, and I speak some Spanish. My Spanish basically comes from, well, recording Hispanos in New Mexico, but also recording Indians in Mexico who speak a pidgin Spanish. And so we communicate. Well, Jesus Rojo told me he was going to sing the song of the leafcutter ant. He told me this in Spanish. And then he started to assume the characteristics physically of the leafcutter ant. And, I mean, he was still a human being, of course, but he was totally a leafcutter ant in his own head. He sang the song 4 times, and then he took many seconds to come back out of it again. Wow. And I realized that he really understands leafcutter ants. But at any rate, that's how I got into recording Indians. And I want to say one other thing.
Yeah,
my friend
absolutely.
Tommy Venom was just retired as the ethnomusicologist at Smithsonian, the main ethnomusicologist. And he was with me on that trip, but he never seen anything like this. And it totally freaked him out. I'd seen it. I didn't actually even seen it in the Hispano culture.
Right.
Because there's a shamanic thing.
And you'd had enough, I guess, field experience within these cultures to, to know what was happening. And
well, it just verified for me how. And then Gary Nabhan, who's a really dear friend too. He's a good man, brilliant man. He's written over 30 books, but he finally told me that from his perspective as a biological scientist, that the Seri Indians know far more about the ecology of their homeland in the Sea of Cortez where they fish than any scientist can ever know.
Yeah.
Because it's not just the linear reductionist approach, it's the whole intuitive approach. And that's what I snapped to too. And it was just such a powerful thing for me. And so I've recorded probably 300 and so just Seri songs. And then I recorded a lot of Tohono O'odham or Papago songs. And Navajo song, well, yeah. But it was always to convey in any kind of a production that I was working on the relationship of culture to habitat, or that person's perspective with regard to himself or herself and the landscape. And that has come through so big to me. And so music, I also had a good friend, he's gone now, named Michael Harner, who started up the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, which is still going on in Mill Valley.
Mm-hmm.
But he started it when he was teaching at the New School back in New York City,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
teaching anthropology. And Mike actually he was initiated into the Jivaro shamanic fraternity or whatever it is down in South America. And it really took his head and heart. And so he started this. And he would get into it through drumming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He started out taking ayahuasca, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
withdrew from the ayahuasca part and got into drumming himself into that state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting to me. And so I got to meet some very interesting friends of his through that.
Mm-hmm.
Like Carlos Castaneda, I got to spend some time talking to him, and that was interesting. Actually, one day Carlos came over with a sack full of Datura metalloides,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea one evening that we all four of us were wipe it on the insides of our thighs and fly over Sather Tower up at Berkeley, but
Oh, wow.
we didn't get off the ground. I'm happy.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, that's how sound, just my archive, which I've donated to the History Museum in Santa Fe,
Mhm.
Museum in New Mexico.
In what format did you donate the archive? Did you just kind
Well-
of give them boxes of stuff? Like,
Well, they've got, somewhere there's a photograph of hundreds of tape, close to 1,000 reels of tape, 7-inch reels. And but in 2001, I got a Ford Foundation grant to do 4 different components to a given project.
Mm-hmm.
Train Native American people in how to record themselves and
Mm-hmm.
preserve their traditions was one component. Produce a radio series, continue with my own field work, and also digitize my entire archive.
So you did digitize it.
And I hired my daughter, who at that time
Awesome.
was going to UNM.
Uh-huh.
She graduated in 2005, I think.
Okay.
And so I tell people it takes a Ford grant to get your kid through college.
Yeah. That's funny. But thank goodness you you got them digitized.
I got it.
Because you can back up the backups when they're digital very easily.
And I've got it all, and even though I donated the whole thing,
Yeah.
I've got 2 copies for myself
That's wonderful.
on Glyph
Yeah.
hard drives.
Yeah, that's really good.
And this last year has been quite a year, with the passing of my wife and everything. But now I'm trying to determine whether or not I have another project
Yeah. Yeah, that's
at 87. What the heck?
you've lived quite a long life. You want to go with the next question?
Sure.
All right, here we go. Yeah, so much on ethnomusicology. All that was gold.
Yeah, but I'm not an ethnomusic. I mean, I never got trained in it,
Right.
but I just did it.
Yeah. You did it well. Huge collection. All right, Southwestern culture. You spoke. I think you spoke a lot about what I'm going to ask already. But if you want to continue to speak to it or say other things or some of the same things, that's fine. Within that context, the American Southwest is a region with rich cultural diversity. As a non-native, how do you approach documenting and preserving the cultural heritage of the region in your work?
Well, that's because it's like a funnel in a way. You start at this little tiny point, and then the whole thing came out like a funnel for me. It didn't take long for me to feel like I was a native of here. I mean, I couldn't get west of the 100th meridian fast enough. When I was a young man, and a kid, I wanted to be out west, and I got here in 1957 and have thus remained. And except for 2 or 3 or 4 years in the Bay Area. I've been here, basically in northern New Mexico, and not restricted to Santa Fe. I've lived in different places in northern New Mexico. I lived for one winter in the Nambe Pueblo, which is interesting. But anyway, I got here, I'd start camping, and camping is the best way to attach yourself to a spot on the planet. It really is. And as I went on, camping all over, not just the Southwest, but the West and Western Mexico, I felt like I myself spiritually was totally affiliated with the arid West, which extends up into the Columbia Plateau, mind you. I mean, it's then on the other side of the range, it starts to get wet again over where you are. But the upshot is that I felt at home everywhere I went. I looked at John Wesley Powell's wonderful map of the arid lands of the West and saw all of those watersheds. And I started thinking in terms of cultural perspective within the context of watershed big time, especially my buddy Bill DuBois, who's a wonderful writer, did a book called Seeing Things Whole, The Essential John Wesley Powell, which of all of the books written about Powell, Worcester and Stegner, I like Bill's by far the best, because it just, you get Powell, he's right there in your face. And Bill knows the Colorado River as well as anybody, and the Colorado River watershed region. But the upshot is that the more I started cruising the West, like I got a grant in 1995, and I've forgotten the name of it was the last grant they gave. Anyway, I produced a 13-part radio series called The Spirit of Place. And I traveled throughout the American West, the 11 western states, and interviewed Native American people throughout the region. And I just felt such an affinity. In other words, I was no longer shy like I was in 1964 about pulling out a recorder. I knew that I was having fun, and that whenever I got into an interview with somebody, they were having fun too. And the whole idea is to have as much fun as you can. And that's what I did. But like I say, trust is an immense factor within that, and treating it properly. And I tried to put back, I gave everybody as I could a copy of the interviews to put where they wanted. As an aside, I'll tell you about this. This shouldn't go into it, but at one point, Rena and her sister Tessie Naranjo at the Tewa Santa Clara Pueblo asked me to come into the Pueblo and record Tessie reading their Tewa English dictionary, which was a mind blow, man. It had been written by Tessie and Rena and Tito. Those are the three siblings, and Rena's grandson, Porter Swensel, who's a brilliant with a PhD. 3 out of 4 of them have PhDs, but it's a beautifully comprehensive dictionary. And it took me 3 or 4 recording sessions to do it, smuggling my recorder into the etc.
Why is that controversial? Sorry, I don't know.
Because nobody who doesn't speak Tewa should hear it.
Oh, I see. Okay. So just to be clear, I'm going to cut this piece from...
Yeah, but it just, that's the level of trust.
Yeah. Okay. I understand what you're saying.
And it has to be on that level, otherwise it doesn't work, and especially if you're going into different cultures. And I've recorded as far away as Japan, and the furthest away was the island of Rarotonga down in the Cook Islands, recording Maori creation myths, which was really far out. But boy, I'll tell you, just realizing through all of that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
the incredible impact that habitat has on a cultural perspective
Mm-hmm.
is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that indigenous perspective is absolutely critical to mainstream cultural perspective or monocultural perspective, because unless we snap to it big time, we're out of here within the next century or less,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is a tough thought.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough thought.
I always feel that the important thing is the work rather than the person who did it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I've always felt that way. No matter what you do, I mean, if you write a book, then your name's on the front of the book. But that's we all knew each other a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
I first met Ed in 1962 in a bar in Santa Fe,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and we didn't get it together until probably around 69 or 70.
Mm-hmm.
And then we realized that we were ahead, and really big time. I mean, what I think of is radical environmentalism. That's when that aspect of it
Mm-hmm.
happened. And in for example, the way I got the coolest gig I've ever had, man, is a fire lookout.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I did that for 3 seasons of 100 days and nights a year, just no tower, just camped on top of this rock.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, I was able to get my pickup up there so I could sleep in it when lightning storms and stuff like that. Because that's no fun to be out on top of a rock.
Totally. With the human lightning rod.
Yeah. And is it true that 4 tires will keep you?
Yeah. Conductors and insulators.
But anyway, I came into Durango one day to get groceries, and there was a map store in town. And they sold maybe 4 or 5 books, and one of them was what this guy I'd drunk a couple of beers with back in 1962. And so I got the book, and it was Desert Solitaire.
Mm.
And I read the book and realized that this is somebody who understood what I understood about the flow of nature and being out in it. And we got together right around the time we started the Black Mesa Defense Fund, which included Jimmy Hopper, Bill Brown, and Terry Moore. Terry joined us shortly after we founded it, and he snapped at what we were doing. And that came to be because Hopi Indians, Bill Brown, who's gone, Jesus, says Jimmy. Terry's still alive, but Bill Brown had worked as the Southwestern historian for the Park Service.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd gotten scuttlebutt about what was happening out on Black Mesa, which I'd gotten a taste of even as early as 64, thinking mines and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I learned that they were going to strip mine Black Mesa for coal. Run a railroad is yet to be constructed from Black Mesa, the north end of Black Mesa, to the shores of Lake Powell, to construct the Navajo generating station, to provide electricity to power up the power plant that pumps to pump water from the Colorado River over into the Central Arizona project.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very complex, and I mean it took forever to understand it. But after Bill told me about this, and also about how water was to be pumped out of the Navajo aquifer, as it's called, beneath Black Mesa, which serves both Navajos in the region and all of the Hopi Springs, at the rate of 2,000 gallons a minute to be pumped in a slurring line over to Loeffler, Nevada, to a power plant, basically light up Las Vegas, etc. And that really bummed me out. I'd started another organization shortly before then, late 69 maybe, called the Central Clearinghouse. The idea was to have a place where stuff in the Southwest that looked like it was going to be environmentally problematic could feed information, and thus it would be dispersed as best we could.
Mm-hmm.
And it was through that that Bill and I learned about this stuff out on Black Mesa. And so we then founded the Black Mesa Defense Fund, and other people began to be the director of the Central Clearinghouse.
Mm-hmm.
Harvey Mudd had given us a grant to start the Central Clearinghouse, and he also let us use the rest of that grant for the Black Mesa Defense Fund, and he then funded the Central Clearinghouse again. And he became one of the directors, as did Brant Culkin, who later became a president of the Sierra Club, and it lasted a long time. It lasted longer than the Black Mesa Defense Fund did, but the Black Mesa Defense Fund's probably, it was very anarchistic in its approach. And I had learned this stuff, and I went out to the Hopis. I had a very good friend who was very old. We later discovered he'd been born in 1873, and this was 1970.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him about it because he was my best friend out at Hopi at that point. And he said, hang on and camp here tonight, which I did in Havila. And the next day, I went into a place in Shamopavi in 63. I told them about the strip mining of Black Mesa, the hauling of the coal to build a power plant, and the sucking of water at the rate of 2,000 gallons a minute out of the aquifer that served their springs.
Mm-hmm.
And they freaked. And I thought, boy, this is beyond anything I thought was going to happen. And I wanted to go in. I thought they were going to take out the tribal council, frankly, but because the tribal council, unbeknownst to them, had signed an agreement with the Peabody Coal Company, St. Louis, East St. Louis, to do the strip mining. And the whole thing had been done by the person who'd been appointed their lawyer, John Boyden, who also worked for the Peabody Coal Company. And so the man spoke with a forked tongue. He was, this is a bad scene, man. And my friend Charles Wilkinson did a beautiful book called Fire on the Plateau that really gets into it as well as anybody did. But anyway, the Hopis came unglued. And after they settled down, they had to discuss all of this in Hopi, of course. Thomas Banyaka was the guy who was their sort of interpreter. But David Manonia, my friend, was the one who said, will you try to help us get this out before the American public? And I said, okay. And so that was the Black Mesa Defense Fund. And so I traveled all over the United States and did presentations. And really, I mean, in those days, I was advocating take it out any way you can, just don't hurt anybody.
Right.
And there's one chapter in this book where I talk about my thoughts with regard to the slurry line. I really wanted to blow it. And then ultimately I had breakfast with a guy who had been one of the designers of it.
Oh, wow.
This isn't in the book. And he said, if you'd have done it, that would have shut it down forever. And I thought, I should have done it.
Oh my gosh.
And Ed Abbey, at that time, was writing the Monkey Wrench Gang, much of which takes place in this same region. And we hooked up and realized that we were so much of ahead, because I was about to start a novel called The Man Who Shot Machines.
Okay.
And Ed said, but I'm writing them.
You got to let me publish this book first.
and I, because he was a writer, I didn't even think about being a writer. I wrote an occasional essay, but anyway, Ed and I spent a lot of time really doing research, etc. And that's how we became real pals, I must say. But anyway, about being, I don't know, who knows how much influence anybody's ever had about anything. I have no idea, to tell you the truth. I know that Dave Foreman heard about the Black Mesa Defense Fund, and he came and was a volunteer with us for a while. And then he founded Earth First. And other people did too. Other people came and volunteered with us because, I mean, those years, my annual income came out for me personally about $2,400 a year.
Oh my gosh.
And so I lived on poached venison, so to speak, and beans.
Yeah.
My wife and
A
I.
lot of pinto beans.
Yeah, a lot of pinto. As a matter of fact, I've got some.
I saw you were soaking up.
But no, when nonprofit organizations, we sure were one of those.
Yeah.
Although we weren't a 501c3, we were just out there doing everything we possibly could.
Right.
And I spent a lot of time making public proclamations in different universities, talking to college people. But as much as anything, I was out there scheming and trying to figure out. And it took forever. And concurrently, my last boss was Lee Udall, who was the wife of former Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, under whose watch all of that stuff sort of came together. And he being a native son of Arizona, I interviewed Stuart about this several times. We talked about, Stuart became a dear friend, actually. The whole family did. Stuart and Lee were like family to me. And they moved to Santa Fe. And we were just hanging out all the time. And at one point I said to Stuart, I've got to try to stop the Black Mesa scene because it's really going to screw up those indigenous peoples out there beyond belief, plus screw up a huge landform that's sacred to these Native American people, plus result in the largest ever coal-fired power plant, which is going to contribute to this totally screwing up the atmosphere of the Southwest, which is going to be one of a bunch of more coal-fired power plant. I had watched the construction of the Four Corners power plant. That was the first one, first big one in the Southwest. And when I went on the line in 1963, which I was here for that, that also contributed big time to my responding to the needs of habitat for human intervention as best we could. And I mean, there's this whole array of things, but the Black Mesa Defense Fund we did our best, and we couldn't do it because we'd taken on the United States government and the state of Arizona and the Peabody Coal Company, and if we'd known the magnitude, we would have done it anyway.
Right.
Because that's what you do.
I want to, this isn't a question here, so you don't have to, you can speak to it however you want or say skip it. So you're talking about your relationship with the Udall family, who sounds like they were for this project.
Well, Stuart was very much, he was.
But you still had, I feel like in today's political landscape, like you're not allowed to be friends with someone who has who's on the other side of the aisle. But hearing from you, it sounds like you kind of were, and that was okay.
We remained friends. I met Stuart. He was still Secretary of the Interior when I met him. And because Lee flew me back to McLean for the gig I was doing, which had to do with designing and traveling exhibition to convey Navajo history from the Navajo point of view, not the Anglo point of view, to Navajos. So I visited all 63 of the BIA schools that then existed on the Navajo reservation, telling them that Anglo history is wrong.
Oh, right.
And Stuart, 2 days before he died, his caregiver called and said, Stuart wants you to come over. And I did, and there he was in his deathbed. And we had a nice, good time. But he said, Jack, you were right. The Central Arizona Project was a mistake.
Huh.
And talk about profound.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm giving you one of the radio programs. Well, I'm giving you a bunch of radio programs, but there are two that I would really appreciate if you did listen to.
Okay.
Because one is a program that is part of one called Moving Waters, the Colorado River and the West that I produced around 2000 or 2001.
Okay.
And I got really into it. I mean, I always get deeply into whatever I'm getting
Sure,
into.
sure.
And Stuart helped me enormously with that radio series. He used in and out of it all over the place. But there's one program in there called Clashes and Contentions, which really gets into an awful lot of the genesis of the whole scene, Glen Canyon Dam. I interviewed Floyd Dominey, who was the commissioner of Bureau of Rec during those days, and who was my arch enemy back in those days. And he certainly knew who I was. So I guess I must have had some sort of an effect.
Right. But at that point.
But I got back there and I interviewed him, and we ended up becoming friends.
So, do you think that would, again, I keep hearing this, and it just seems your dynamic with the people you're interviewing, whether these indigenous people or people who are supporting industrial projects that are going to hurt the environment, hurt the culture, hurt the people living on the land, and yet you maintain a friendship with them, or you build a friendship with them. They give you an interview. Not only do they give you an interview, and then through the interview, you kind of become.
Well, at the end of the one with Floyd,
yeah.
I mean, we looked at each other and we realized we'd been at totally opposite ends of the spectrum with regard to that whole scene, the dams on the Colorado River.
Right.
And at the end of it, we laughed because we realized that we were both men of particularly strong opinion, and there's no sense in not having a strong opinion. If you have one, if it isn't strong, forget it.
So yeah, but over and over again, the theme here is you're able to find one or two positive attributes with someone who has ideas or projects they've worked on that you disagree with, and use those positive attributes to form a foundation for friendship.
Well, it's basically we're fellow humans.
Yeah.
And we have to recognize our humanity in each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot nicer to make friends than enemies. I've made a fair number of them, believe me, back in
Sure.
I never hurt anybody, though. That was my law to myself, was never hurt a fellow human, no matter what I was getting into.
Right.
But
fascinating. Well, thank you for speaking deeper to that, and just giving me a lot more history on your in the Black Mesa Defense Fund.
Well, that was a big one for me. And at the end of it, when we closed the doors, I hated it, but I knew that there was no way we could win because billions of dollars have become involved at this point, and at $2,400 a year, you don't have much of a chance.
Yeah. Find a big machine. All right. Let's see, question 6.
Oh, and the other program I'd like you to listen to features Gary Snyder and Dave Foreman.
Oh, that'd be really cool to listen to. Consciousness and connection to the land. Can you read the Hopi Indian segment of the book?
Yeah.
Through we're emotionally connected to it.
Yeah. I wish I could pull up that particular piece of excerpt of Philip actually saying it, but I couldn't. I tried.
Oh, that's okay.
Pardon me. Okay, well, this is from my book, A Pagan Polemic, and it features thinking from my friend Philip Tawalitztua. This first part is something I just wrote. The Hopi Indians inhabit 3 southern promontories of Black Mesa in what is now northern Arizona. Their village of Oribe is nearly 1,000 years old and is considered by some, I put in, to be the oldest continuously inhabited village in what is presently the contiguous 48 states, United States. As remote and as deeply embedded in cultural traditions as they are, the Hopis have been besieged by a monoculture intent on extracting minerals, resources, and water from their homeland. Their sense of connectedness to the land is ancient and runs deep. Philip Tuwalitstua was born into traditional Hopi culture and was trained as a geodesist. For some time, he served as the assistant director of the National Geodetic Survey. He's a man who always knows where he is. And I quote Philip Tuwalitstua, "We talk about the Sipapu, place of Hopi emergence, of being a place of being always in our memories, our thoughts. It is only one of thousands of places like that. There are hundreds of shrines all over northern Arizona and southern Utah and southern Colorado that are connected in our minds and our consciousness. We think of them in terms of what do they mean to us as a tribal people. We know that this clan or that clan was there. We know that this is the place where you go to get a particular mineral, an herb, a particular plant. We are familiar that something happened there a long time ago that affected us. It has an emotional content to it. We are emotionally connected to it, and that is why Hopis are emotionally connected to our landscape in its entirety." End of quote.
Thank you for reading that. So when I read that, and it really jumped out at me because I feel like I understand the idea of deep connection to the land through my own wilderness experiences, and I want to put the camera back on you and see if are there any wilderness experiences you've had that have allowed you to tune into your own connection with the landscape?
There's so many of them, I can't enumerate them, but a biggie is doing fire lookouts for 3 seasons where there's no tower. I mean, you're just there.
You're just in it.
And wow, I mean, camped on that rock for 100 days and nights a year was just as good as it gets. And I felt like I became part of habitat. And that was a big one. I mean, one time, well, I still had my trumpet with me. I still do. But one time I pulled it out and I still had some chops. And I started playing. And then I heard a turkey gobble. And I played some more. And then I heard a coyote sing. And pretty soon all 3 of us were doing it together. And that was cool. I mean, we were doing a sonata for coyote, turkey, and jazz trumpet player, and it was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had.
Oh, I bet.
And, I felt like I'm here. I made it. And that was good. One of the things that Ed and I talked about a lot at Abbey, because we camped and camped and camped all over the place, all over the Southwest and parts of Mexico. But we figured it took a good 10 to 12 days to get into that state of mind that you want to be in when you're out in it like that, which to me is the best state of mind there is, really. And it's not a state of mind, it's a watershed of mind. It really is. But there are places that I've been that have also evoked that deep sense. I mean, for example, Ed and I used to camp up on Cedar Mesa, Muley Point, long time ago. Starting back in the 70s sometime. And we'd be the only people there.
It was a dirt road, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they only put the paved road in the last handful of years because I remember it being a dirt road the last time I was there.
Well, I haven't been there since probably 2015 or 16.
Yeah. Do you remember it being paved then?
It wasn't.
Yeah.
Bummer, man.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's got fresh asphalt on it, and there's Wi-Fi there. It's changed.
well, I'll tell you, man, this is the first time in 60 years that I haven't lived on a dirt road.
Yeah. Oh wow.
I mean, this is fine because
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
deer come and sleep in the yard, and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
bear nailed the jack-o'-lantern pumpkin
Oh, there you go.
on Halloween. But no, being out in it on that level, one big time for me was hiking down into the Barranca del Cobre in the Sierra Madre Occidental and just seeing Tarahumara people running up and down the trail while I was slogging up and down the trail, especially up the trail. And
When was this?
the 60s.
Okay. So way before. Are you familiar with the book Born to Run?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
way before.
Yeah, yeah.
No,
So
this
that
was-
book, like, I feel like that book kind of put that culture on the map to the people who run in the United States.
Yeah, no, my son-in-law, I think, knows the guy who did that book
Yeah, yeah.
because he's been a runner, but he's a great biker,
Mhm.
bicyclist. But no, I lived for a while in a cave with Tarahumaras down there. And another time, even earlier on, I lived in a Huichol Indian village in the Rio Chapalagana watershed, which is further south in really remote country. And the habitat was exquisite, but the culture was the furthest out culture I've ever seen.
Mhm.
They were a peyote culture. And I happened to be there during their annual peyote fiesta, and I recorded a little bit of it. In those days, the recorder I lugged around in my backpack, which weighed a ton,
Mhm.
had very limited battery life, and I had very limited batteries,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
I could only get a little bit of it. But it's archived in the museum. But anyway, the upshot is that I've camped in all four of the American deserts and all over the Colorado Plateau and beyond. And always gotten as far away as I could. And it all speaks to me, man. It's just, the American West is special. The aridity is the biggest configuration here, but I've never run the Colorado. Ed and I were going to run it. Then he died, so we didn't. And I didn't feel like I wanted to do it after that.
Mhm.
But running the Green, that was a good trip. One of the trips went through Desolation Canyon.
Mhm.
It was Dave Foreman and Nancy, his wife,
Mhm.
who's gone too. And Gary Snyder was on it, and his wife, who is now gone, Carol. And Peter Coyote, who's a movie actor who narrates Ken Burns films and stuff.
Oh wow.
But Peter is a good friend, and I've got to send him a copy of this. But we all put our perspectives into it because it's, as you know, a 10-day trip
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
Deso. And I had my own boat then. I quit. I gave it away, man, about
Mhm.
10, 12 years ago. I could have still done it, but there were so many folks on the river, I just didn't do it anymore.
Yeah. It's just the popularity of that flow trip, especially during the season. It's just it has to feel, going back to what you were saying, like reserving campsites.
Yeah. I got to tell you, man, one of those special experiences that you wanted came to me. My friends Bill Brown and Carl Kernberger, who was my business partner, we had a company called the Four Brothers Adventure Company.
Okay.
And we floated the lower canyons of the Rio Grande. Have you ever been there?
I haven't.
You go to Big Bend, and there's a place called Boquillas Canyon. There are 3 canyons in the Big Bend National Park region. Of course, the river separates Mexico from U.S. Down there. And we put in Boquillas Canyon, and the river was running way high. They wouldn't let us put in on the American side because bureaucracy. The river was too high.
Right.
And so we went across the river and put it in Mexico. And that was a great run. And one night, man, it was in March of 1974 or 5 when we did this. And we got to a rapid that was the only one we had to portage. We couldn't figure a way around it. And we were really remote. I mean, it was about as far away as Rarotonga was. And we looked up in the sky. We were sitting there drinking beer and looked up in the sky. And at any given moment, we could see about what we figured about 800 turkey vultures.
Oh my gosh.
And then they all landed in the cliff above us. And we estimated, ultimately, all 3 of us, we were really giving our best shot as bird watchers. And we figured there were 3,000 turkey vultures in the cliff above us. And we thought, is this a cool place to camp? But I mean, the turkey consciousness was prevailed. And it was one of those times when you really understood that there's more to cognition than human consciousness.
In his book, The Systems View of Life, The Unifying Vision, Fritjof Capra introduced me to 2 Chilean biologists, Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, both of whom are gone now, but Varela died earlier on, but Maturana forwarded the notion that life and cognition are 2 aspects of the same phenomenon, even at the cellular level. If it's alive, it's cognitive. Otherwise, how can it stay alive? And that blew my mind. I mean, thinking in those terms of cognition at all levels of life really ratified for me the notion that the planet is indeed a living organism, because it fostered all of this in conjunction with the sun. In other words, the sun and the earth produced life about 3.8 billion years ago. One of the chapters in this book that I still have fun with thinking about is the one on Luca, the last universal common ancestor, and how we are all related to Luca.
Yeah, it's at the DNA level, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
every human's DNA has this slice that goes back to this common ancestor.
Thus, we are related to every other living organism that has ever lived prior to Luca. There were ostensibly, according to my limited research, other living cells, but they died off and didn't last. But Luca did.
It's the Homo sapien mother.
Yeah.
So over and over again, there's these. You've had these experiences where you're seeing the connectedness of humans and the connection of different biota within the landscape, which I find I find really fascinating and important. Just in general, and I want to support it. I don't have a question.
Well, it is. I mean, it is so connected, and that's what I love, and that's what Ed and I were talking about when you get out there and you get there long enough, and you're in it long enough, you sense it. And to me, what we have really done in this culture that is so askew, our predominant culture, we've really squashed the notion or the importance of intuition. And that's what comes through big time when you're out in the wilderness or when you're with a culture that still intuitively into it. And to me, intuition is at least as important as intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get comfortable with combining the two in your day-to-day life, which is what I've really striven for, it really works. And to me, you just see it so much more deeply.
You're out there.
Yeah. And I try to bring it home with me every time I go out there. And that's what I did with peyote. I tried to bring that back with me so that it would always be with me, because it was so apparent to me, life happening in the planet. One time on peyote, where I loved to go to take the peyote was at the north end of Pyramid Lake, which is north of Reno, 32 miles north of Sparks. And you can't go there anymore because it's a Paiute reservation. And so many people have now gotten to go out there and mess it up. But back in the 60s, the early 60s, I'd go out there, and my first wife would be with me, but I'd fast for 3 or 4 days, and then of a morning I'd take the peyote. And I never really threw up. Other people always did, but once you made it past the nausea and it opened up, it became ever so clear what reality really is. I like that view of reality. But one time I was up there looking at my view of reality through peyote eyes, and I saw a cow stuck in quicksand. And so I went up there. I drove up. Imagine yourself like in mushroom. But I drove up, and because I knew I couldn't get it out without a truck, and I pulled out a rope, and I put it around I could get to the horns.
Right.
And then I would slowly move the truck forward, and then I'd go back and talk to the cow.
Oh my gosh.
And finally, it took hours. I finally got it out of the quicksand, and that was that peyote experience.
That's so bizarre. I don't know how to describe it, because it's so you were in the peyote world and in the real world at the same time, trying to help this.
Yeah, but the empathy was outstanding, you know.
It's like, not gonna let this cow die. Had you been there in a different state of mind, maybe you would have just kept driving. So yeah, let me lead into this a little bit with this paragraph that says, separate from my own wilderness experience, a few years ago I did a therapeutic mushroom trip. On this journey I traveled forward and back in time and felt emotionally connected to everything. There was no organic versus inorganic separation, and places like star systems in the Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light years away from our home in the Milky Way. You know, in this mushroom world, I transported to planets in other star systems that had life. And in this mushroom world, it seems so obvious to me that the space entire civilizations have lived and died on other planets in the universe, and that not only was I connected to everything on my home planet, I was also a small part of the universe at large. I had a sense of my small place within the cosmos for the first time, and a deep desire to be a better steward of my home planet. It is difficult to articulate in writing a trip report of this nature. The simplest way for me to talk about it with people is to say that I had a metaphysical experience, and afterward I felt more connected to the landscape and humanity at large. Now, when I read stories like the one in your book about the Hopis, I feel that I can better understand what it's like for a culture to have a sense of place that connects them to the landscape holistically. I know through my own studies of anthropology that these tribes have used psychedelics for religious ceremonies for generations, and I suspect that one of the positive outcomes for the people is a deep sense of connection to the land beyond the typical Western capitalistic baseline consciousness. That is a long lead up to my next question, which is, looking back at your own psychedelic journeys, to what extent do you feel like they stretched your own sense of consciousness and connection to the landscape?
Big time. The first time I took peyote was on a houseboat
Don't worry about that one. You can just keep going. We'll go off the other camera.
was in a houseboat in Gate 5 in Sausalito. And it was a New Year's Eve, I think, New Year's 1960, 61. And it totally turned me on, but I realized that I wanted to be outside. So I got in a rowboat with a friend, and I was rowing around. Actually, two friends, one of whom decided he wanted to walk back. And I had to convince him that might not be a good idea.
Can't walk on water, buddy.
You may be far out, but you're not that far. But anyway, I think the next time was in that teepee with 5 different Indian cultures. And then a group of us, we had it was like a cohort of folks who would take peyote together. And the same guy who wanted to walk on water had found this cave at the north end of Pyramid Lake. He himself was part Sioux Indian. And so we would go there and go into this cave, which was a really nice place. And we'd sit in there and build a fire, and the smoke would go. Obviously, that cave had been used for a lot of things for who knows how long. But the upshot is that I really liked taking it basically by myself or with my first wife. I never took it with my wife of 52 years, Kath, who just passed away. But because she used to smoke pot, and then it just didn't affect her properly. But anyway, yes, peyote was a huge factor in the evolution of my own consciousness, probably as much as any other huge factor was. I won't use the analogy that it was the A-bomb of psychedelics for me, but it was really powerful for me. And being at that place up north of Pyramid Lake, when I'd eat it by myself or with my wife, I wouldn't be in the cave. I found a place where I could look out at this extremely primordial looking landscape. It didn't look like anything present. It looked like it belonged to some distant past on the planet Earth. And so I had amazing experiences there. I had really good friends who were into other kinds of psychedelics. Like I had one friend who'd taken acid over 300 times.
Oh my gosh.
And survived in beauty. He became Ram Dass. It was Dick Alpert.
Oh wow.
I knew him back when he was Dick, and then and he had one bad trip, not on acid but on something else. And he showed up at my house and said, "Help me through this one," which I did. And he had been born into Hebrew culture. He was Jewish, so the first thing I did after I got him comfortable in the house, this was back in the '60s, I went and got as much Jewish food as I could at a delicatessen in Santa Fe, and started feeding him Jewish food and maybe playing him some Jewish music, just to see if I could take him back into. And he did fine, and he came out of it, and all was well. But I haven't seen. Well, he died, but we would compare trips, so to speak. And I took acid once, and it didn't take me. I mean, it was all far out, and I wasn't bummed. I wasn't in a negative spot, but it just seemed superficial.
Right.
Relative to the organicism, so to speak, of the peyote or pot. I'm probably going to take some mushrooms here pretty quick. I haven't taken them yet, but I'll give it a shot and see what happens to my consciousness.
Yeah, there's a music file that I used from a person who was a researcher at Cambridge, and Mendel Kalen, I think is his name. He did his PhD there, and I can give you that music file.
That'd be cool.
That is what I use to kind of guide my own trip, and it traveled to these places. And I was at home, and I'd save setting with like an eye mask on and like a weighted blanket. But listening to that track, like, was a big part of the experience for me.
Yeah.
And much like hearing you, it's like looking at some of these landscapes, being in a cave, being in a place where you can see, see the earth, how that made it so much more than just a drug experience.
Oh, yeah.
That, was really shaping the way you viewed yourself in the world and the broader landscape. And I would go as far out to say the cosmos.
Well, the peyote sure changed my life. I mean, how to put it, man? I mean, I've been a jazz player, and jazz happens in cities. And I was never comfortable in cities, but in order to play jazz, that's kind of where I had to be. Mm-hmm. And like the best jazz city I ever played in was Indianapolis. I was usually the only white guy on the stand. Mm-hmm. And that was, to me, a joy. But getting out I go outside every chance I get. I walk every day, even though I can't walk as far. It's my only advice to young people is to break as few bones as possible.
Right.
And I mean that. And being out in it, that's what I always did the peyote, almost always outside. Only 2 times that I can think of was I inside part of the day. But I've been I lived outside most of the 1960s. Mm-hmm. I just didn't want to be inside. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then that really made me feel ever more protective of habitat, and why I became sort of a rabid environmentalist. Mm-hmm. And I'd talk to kids in Ohio State University when I was doing the Black Mesa Defense Fund, mm-hmm. and tell them to go out and take it down, mm-hmm. literally take it down, blow it up, but don't hurt anybody. That's the one law: don't hurt a soul. And it got to the point where there was this face that always appeared at the back of the room in my different lectures around. And I said, that guy he's my biggest audience. He comes to every one of my lectures, and he stopped coming.
Have you ever, this is a tangent, but I'm going to go on it real quick. Have you ever FOIA'd your records? I'm sure that was the FBI.
Yeah.
Have you ever Freedom of Information?
No, but when I did the book about Ed Abbey, I got his.
Yeah, so I read his too, and not to cut you off, but to give you, I read this guy Sean Prentice's book, Finding Abbey, and he interviewed you for that book. And when I read that book, I was like, why didn't Sean, FOIA those records? So I emailed the FBI, or I sent a FOIA request to the FBI. Surprisingly, they emailed me like a few days later, like, we have them on our website. You can just download them here. And I downloaded them, and I was expecting a bunch of investigative work on ecoterrorism, sabotage, and it was all, ironically, because I was reading this right around the January 6th time, like people trying to take over the Capitol for Trump, and they were investigating him for sedition, conspiracy to like take over the United States, because when he got back from World War II, he was like one of the first guys to like
Burn a draft
car.
Yeah.
And it was like, holy crap. I mean, it really just blew me away.
Yeah,
because
then
the magnitude was so small. He wrote something on a typewriter and put it on a bulletin board in the English department of a university, and was investigated by 3 different bureaus for decades.
Yep.
And just to contrast that to like, just like what's on the news every day, which I don't watch, and I don't think necessarily, I don't know if any, I won't say people should or shouldn't watch the news, but I feel like there's these echo chambers on both sides that are way, people just say stuff that's so much more inflammatory to the government now on regularly than what Ed wrote that catalyzed that investigation and those records.
No, I used those. I caught them. I've never wanted to. I know who I am. I don't need the FBI to tell me. Anyway.
Yeah, your records. Well, maybe I will on your behalf.
But
because it sounds like they were.
But they really nailed, well, when Dave Foreman got busted, Jesus, that was 6 weeks after Ed Abbey died,
okay,
that Dave got busted. And he called me up and asked if I'd head up his defense fund, which I did. I mean, I had to say I'm not a great fundraiser, but I'll do anything I can, man. And we were able to raise enough with a lot of help from a lot of people to get him through that trial. But at one point, he had 2 attorneys. One was Jerry Spence, and another one was a guy named Sam Giberson, who was a specialist in bugged telephone calls and recorded illicit recordings. And they called me up, Sam did, and said, would you be willing to go to FBI headquarters and make duplicates of all of the recordings the FBI made? We've got a court order to get it done. And I said, of course. And so I spent 2 weeks,
oh my gosh,
business days, in the one down in Phoenix, Scottsdale.
Okay. So you went to a regional office.
And I listened to them, 63 hours of tape. And I dubbed it onto reel-to-reels. I used my Nagra to dub it, so they were good recordings, which became the property then of Sam Giberson. And I didn't keep any, but this is a bit funky, but I'll tell you the truth. At one time, near the end of this, the second to last day, I think, this new person came into the room. There was always at least one person in the room with me.
Right, babysitter.
Yeah. And he said, I'm the guy who's responsible for making these recordings. And can you teach me a better way to bug a microphone or bug a telephone? And I said, are you out of your fucking mind? It just came out of my mind.
Like, you're on the wrong side.
He was not a person with whom I made friends, I must say. But
Not gonna be friends, buddy.
But anyway, no, it was. There's an insidious side to the whole governmental thing. Well, much of the government now, to me, is insidious anyway. And who knows what's going to happen next year at the election time. But I feel, at this point, from an anarchist perspective, that anybody who goes into political office is hugely likely to be swayed by fiscal circumstances, and who will be psychologically aligned with the corporate model, because a book that I highly recommend is The Capitalism Papers, Fatal Flaws of an Obsolete System, written by Jerry Mander, who used to work closely with Dave Brower and helped us a lot in the Black Mesa days. Jerry, who was also born 1936, died earlier this year. It's been quite a year, but political consciousness, especially in America, has been totally subsumed by the corporate structure, the military industrial complex, which Ed warned us about. I was very aware of back in the day before Ed and I started doing stuff together. President Eisenhower, going out of office in 1961, said, beware the military industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
This is a president, a Republican president, saying this in 1961. And what happened during the final days of World War II were that all of the people who were among the Allied forces, who fought the Axis forces in World War II, members of all of those countries got together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and came up with a plan that would result in the World Bank and basically the whole corporate economic...
Capitalism.
Yeah.
Neoliberal economic policy.
Yeah. And
Mouthful.
TV happened at the same time. And boy, oh boy. So we're now into 3 generations at least of people who have been dominated by a picture on the wall, that moves, the television set. And now, today, I'm so concerned about, the other day, man, I watched a guy drive by with no hands on the handlebars of his bicycle, taking a selfie.
Oh my gosh.
And I thought, he's not destined for long life.
Yeah, it's a hobby.
But, I mean, to think that we are so conditioned to that sort of a techno-fantasy world, that it's going to take something huge, and I rely on the young now to get past that and start looking at Habitat for what it is, to get out into it and become really active. And I know a lot of young people who are already, and because it's going to take the young people to save us from ourselves.
Absolutely. It's clear from your book, A Portrait of Ed, that Edward Abbey was a dear friend to you, and that you both connected best through the many outdoor trips you took together and the conversations you had about life along the way. So my random question was, is it true you hold the manuscript to the Monkey Wrench Gang?
Yep, it's right there.
And we have it right here. So I'm excited to look at that and maybe take some video of it too after finish this interview. One thing I want to just speak to in terms of manuscripts is, I think I learned this from Sean Prentice, who wrote the book Finding Abbey, is it's really interesting intellectually to think about a person beyond just their book. And when I first read Desert Solitaire, which was the first Abbey book I read, I was just thinking about the stories in that book and not much about the person beyond it. And Ed kind of Sean opened my eyes to thinking more deeply about authors in general and their craft. And so this idea that there's this manuscript that shows, an early version before publication, I think is really interesting. So I'm excited to see that.
Yeah, he brought it. I think it was 1975, the year it was published. At Thanksgiving time, he brought it to me along with 12 LP records of the collected organ works of Johann Sebastian Bach. He said, I listened to it, now you have to.
So why do you think he gave you the manuscript? Is it just because he cared? He knew? I don't want to try and answer that, I guess.
Well, we were really good pals, man. I mean,
You must have.
we had made vows,
Yeah.
and we were like brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there were 2 or 3 of them, and I think this is the one that was the final one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And but Ken Slight had one, But there was a big fire, and I'm just hoping like mad that Ken's Monkey Wrench Gang didn't get burned up. It's because they were good friends, and spiritually, it would just be a wipeout for Ken to have lost it to a fire up in Moab.
I want to speak a little bit more to manuscripts too. In the 1970s, pre the Apple II computer, where you wrote on a computer and you saved your work like in real time, and then because when I was at I told you early, maybe before the interview, that I went to Tucson, and at the university there they have a special collections library where Ed gave them like boxes and boxes.
Yeah, his papers, everything.
His papers, and for me, some of the most interesting things in there certainly are the manuscripts. And for example, actually with Monkey Wrench Gang, I'll just speak to that. There's a draft, or maybe version 1, and then there's like a version 2, and it looks like he types out the version, it goes to the editor, they give him notes, some of which he accepts, some of which he rejects, and then he types the whole book again.
Yeah, well, I don't know how many times he typed it.
Yeah,
that I've never asked him, but
but that concept is like, I think a younger generation, even from my generation, I take it for granted that you revision so easy.
No, not. I did 2 books, man, on a typewriter, and I know
you had to retype them.
Yeah, and it's a trip, and boy, is it ever.
So with the writing process, or hurts, or
you're writing. You're writing. I mean, I feel good about the writing. The first book I did, which Ed insisted be a book, was based on a radio series.
Okay.
The one that the interview with Garrett Hardin's in, and other people, called Headed Upstream. And I typed that up a couple of times, 3 or 4 times. But it didn't bother me to do it.
Did you just have a schedule where you like wake up, drink, get a pot of coffee, and then just like sit down and you're like, okay, version 2, I got my notes.
You just keep doing it. And the one that was a whopper, man, I'll show you the book after we're done, was the one on Hispano folk music, because that was when somebody had a computer finally to be able, I had to transcribe songs, the notes for songs, and my handwriting sucks, man. I mean, it just does. And so I found something that I could do. I can't even remember what I did it on because I didn't have a computer yet. But I was able to get the transcription so they look like they're supposed to, like that, And then I did drawings of how to do the dances. And Masa, who was Gary Snyder's wife before the one that he married who died, Masa, who was a dancer, helped me with that to make sure that it jibed. And this is all pre-computer, and so it was a trip to make it look good. But and I'm a 2-fingered typist.
Oh wow!
And Ed was.
Yeah.
He knew how to type, but he did the whole thing on, and he abhorred the notion of a computer.
Yeah, I bet.
And if you listen to the whole hour plus whatever it is that I did with Ed, you'll get the hit pretty much on everything in his mind. But no, it was writing on a computer is so much easier than it used to be. But back in those days, typing was a heck of a lot easier than writing it in longhand. And Charles Dickens wrote all of his in longhand.
Right. So it was still an evolution on the computer.
Yeah, and so now there are ostensibly things that you can speak to that will print out your words. Yeah. And I don't know if I'm into that.
Yeah, the voice transcription.
I still take daily
Yeah.
I write in my computer journal and also in my handwritten journal. And I got bunches of those, that go back. But I never look back at them.
Right. You just kind of move forward.
Yeah, the whole thing is that I find that writing is a really cool way to think.
I agree.
So, boy. But I know he gave one to Ken and he gave one to me. And I don't know if he gave one to anybody else, but I think this is the one that was the final one. And, well, just for one quick second, I want to open up.
Yeah.
Oh, and this is his flag. Let's open it up. Open it up.
Oh, the monkey wrench on the flag.
Yeah, and that was.
So my second question, or my follow-up question, and this goes to it, was: did Ed create the monkey wrench?
No.
As the symbol.
No, the monkey wrench is an idea. I'm going to set this down for just one
Go
sec.
for it.
My wife made this. She was a bookbinder.
So who? What are all these signatures here?
That was on a river trip, and the guy who was on the river trip with him had made this flag up.
Oh, I see.
Ed's signature's on there, as is Becky's, his daughter's, who was also on the river trip. So my thought is to how does this work? Yeah. My wife was a meticulous crafts person. It's you gotta here, this is easier.
Oh, there you go. Oh, I see. It's like
She bound it, she put it in a book form. But there it is. But I'm sorry that
no, you got it. I got it.
And there's a picture of Brower and me. We've been out camping. He was a good friend. And there's Bill Brown. He's one of my best pals.
Gosh, what a network.
I know it's here somewhere. Yeah, here it is. That's me in 1964 inside the Hogan.
Navajo Mountain. Wow.
And here's a picture of the outside of the Hogan.
And that was, it came up in the interview. It's such a transformative experience for you in terms of, just setting almost a foundation for the work that would come.
Yeah. Yeah, there it is. Lived in that for 6 months. And that's Gene on the left, or your right-hand side, me on the left.
All right. Many people who knew Ed personally have passed on. You are one of a shrinking cohort of folks that knew him personally. What do you want the future cohort of environmental writers and historians to know about Ed, knowing that some people will judge him through his work, him and his work through the lens of their own contemporary and cultural values?
That's a good question, and I've thought a lot about just that. First of all, I want to say that to me, Ed was infinitely more complex than is revealed in his books. And conversations that we had for so long really released that into my own mind, He had a beautiful mind. What I would want anybody to think about is that we have entered a time that was just beginning to become apparent to some of us way back when, that is now revealed to be an incredibly dangerous time environmentally. In other words, depending on whose research you consider, we have 30 years, 20 years, maybe we've passed the point of no return. This is what I've read. I mean, and so what I would hope is that what people would take to heart from Ed's writing is to take protection of habitat even more seriously than is revealed in Ed's books. In other words, it is absolutely vital, not just for the continuity of the human species, but for so many other species. Actually, the biotic community as it exists on planet Earth is gravely threatened right now because of human influence. My friend Melissa Savage, a brilliant woman, one of my best friends, whom I've known for over 50 years, who is a biogeographer, now emerita at UCLA. She looks at it philosophically from the point of view that that life on planet Earth will continue, but that an entirely different biotic community will emerge than the one in which we currently live. And that indeed we've had 5 major spasms of extinctions prior to this one, but this one is the only one that's been caused by a species itself. Mm-hmm. And so that's the bottom line. And so Ed Abbey was in the forefront of trying to protect the environment, of protecting habitat, of seeing wilderness replaced rather than reduced. And he would use any tool that was available to him to do that. And he didn't just write about it. He did it, but he never hurt anybody. I recall a conversation that Dave Foreman and Ed and I had once about the importance of stressing causing no harm to any fellow human. Mm-hmm. And so what we see is the milieu, the cultural milieu that currently exists relative to Ed's, who died on March 14th, 1989, which will be 35 years coming on this coming March in 2024. I think that the population was about half what it is now when Ed died. There were computers, but they were big, huge machines in universities that had huge wheels of tape, and there were cards that punched holes in them. Those were the first computers that I was aware of in New Mexico, where they had some major computers, both at Los Alamos, at Sandia Lab. New Mexico has 2 national laboratories, and then it has places like the university in Socorro, which is super, I think of it as evolved techno-fantasy, And at any rate, Ed has to be seen for what he was, a guy born into Appalachia and before the beginning of the Great Depression, who was forged by the Great Depression. I was born in the middle of it. I remember it. And I was basically forged by World War II. Mm-hmm. America was a different place when both Ed and I were growing up. A hugely different place. I was born just after the human population got to be 2 billion. Ed was born before it got to be 2 billion. And now it's over 8 billion. So bear in mind what sort of a headset that must be. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to imagine Abraham Lincoln riding in a car with me and what he would be thinking, how much it would blow his mind. And for people who are coming into teenage and older consciousness today, you would be looking at a totally different way of looking at reality than Ed did. Ed saw it sort of up front and in the middle of it. And people who are so into digital technology that they're seeing reality through their iPhones, it's a totally different perspective. And I, for one, of course, I'm an old guy, but I far prefer the former than the latter, because I want to see reality for what it is and not what it's digitized up to look like. So that's where I'm coming from, and where I think, I know Ed himself imagined it to be the worst possible world, one that was dominated by the industrial digitization hadn't really even happened yet. As a matter of fact, I bought a used Macintosh computer with, I was told, had all the memory I needed, 20 megabytes.
Oh, wow.
And that's what I wrote the first draft of my book on Ed with. Ed had asked me to be his, how did he put it, chronicler on 2 or 3 different occasions, more actually. And I tried to be as honest as I could be in that book. One of Ed's mottos was follow the truth no matter where it leads. And the other one was with his finger pointed at the sky, resolve. And I respected that enormously because he had both resolve and he gave it his best shot to write it down the way he saw it. And so what Ed's writing expresses is his perception of the cultural milieu in America as he perceived it as it was happening between 1950 and 1989 when he died. So that's not just the way they look at Ed's writing, it's having to look at the milieu. It's always really important to look at that aspect of it, the habitat. Where's your home habitat?
All right.
Ed never owned a camera.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's not that many photos of him. Yeah. Okay, you right? Well, actually, I want to just speak to that for a little bit before I get into this. His writing was the camera.
Yeah.
You know, like his imagery was on his. You're transported to this place, and it's like magic.
Oh, he was an amazing writer.
And that's the difference between him and someone like me, who, like, someone reads my work and it's like, if I write something, it's like a camping story, and for him it's very moving, and I can feel what it's like to be there, and that's, going back to Desert Solitary as an example, like that book was based off journals he wrote in 1956 that were published around 10 years later, and definitely had a profound impact on me.
Yeah, hugely beautiful book.
And just steering my life towards this place. So, and the desert in general. Okay, last question on it. You write about your part in executing Ed's final wishes to be buried out in the desert by his closest friends. In short, after your friend passed away, you took him to an undisclosed desert location where he felt connected to the earth for interment without asking permission from any government organizations. This was his wish. This story is one of a kind. And most people would never do this type of thing, even for their best friend. What led to this level of friendship and camaraderie with Ed?
Wow, well, about somewhere in the early 70s, we were camped up in the Piceance Basin where they wanted to shoot off atomic bombs to make pockets of oil.
Oh my gosh.
And Ed was supposed to be writing an article about that, but we took a hike one night and got into our normal conversational mode. And at one point he stopped on the trail and said, "Jack," which is the way he always prefaced it. And then, "Would you agree," or words to this effect, "to bury me if I die before you, if I guarantee you that I'll bury you if you die before me?" So we made a vow that night. And it was a hard duty vow, I'll tell you. We really looked into each other's eyes big time.
Mm-hmm.
And because this was huge trust. But we had that. And we agreed to it. And that was how that came about. And part of it had to do with not dying in a hospital. Jesus busted him out of the hospital 2 times in 10 days. The first time, he thought he was dying and he didn't want to be in the hospital anyway. He'd had a bleed. And so I stole a wheelchair from this woman's room in the hospital and put Ed in it and wheeled him out of the hospital. And Clark, his wife, or his widow now, was running interference for me, and I drove away like mad and got him out of the hospital then.
Is Clark passed away? So...
No, she's alive.
Okay.
She refuses to be
Right.
interviewed.
Right, okay.
And no, she remains a dear friend.
Mm-hmm.
We're in contact. And she's remarried. And she and my wife are close, very close friends. But Ed, some years later, a good decade later probably, I had 2 houses, the one that my wife and I first built, and then when it got too crowded, we sold that place and bought a place out more in the country. But when we were still in that house, in the canyon in Santa Fe, Ed and Clark and Susie, I think Susie was with them, came by to visit. And Ed had wanted to see if I knew of a doctor because he had a pain in his gut. And curiously, the guy who was my doctor at that time and myself were running the Rio Chama, which is a neat little run, beautiful run. And so I got home and there were the Abbeys staying with us. And Ed was saying, "I've got this pain in my gut." They'd been up in near Great Sand Dunes, National Monument, over in the San Luis Valley, where he was in a borrowed cabin from Jim Carrico. He borrowed a cabin to write, I don't know what he was writing, Good News? Anyway, whatever it was. But anyway, later that afternoon, he keeled over in pain in the living room. And so Clark and I hauled him off to the hospital. This is after Ed and I made the vow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we checked him into the hospital. We always had a bit of gallows humor going, no matter what.
Right.
The first thing that happened was I was at the desk doing some paperwork on Ed's behalf, and some nurse came up and started to roll up my sleeve. And I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Well, Mr. Abbey." And I said, "Us guys with beards all look alike." He was considerably taller. He was 6'3". In those days, I was about 5'11". I've shrunk. But anyway, a doctor came in, a specialist came in, and diagnosed Ed with pancreatic cancer with 2 months to live. And I looked at it and I said, well, I'm here for your disposal. And he turned and looked at me and he said, well, at least I don't have to floss anymore. And but I was letting him know that whatever went down,
Yeah.
and he knew it. And then finally, we talked him into getting another medical opinion. It was a trip getting everybody back down to Tucson. Clark and Susie were going to drive back to Tucson, and their truck broke down in Albuquerque, fortunately. It broke down there, and they got a motel room, and I was going to have taken Ed to the airport the next day to get him to fly down there in case he had some sort of a whatever. And so, kind of remember all of this stuff. I had a pickup truck in those days, and I went in a tow bar that I got from another guy I buried named John Muir, the guy who did the book on how to fix a VW for the complete idiot.
Okay.
And
So did you bury him before or after Ebby?
before.
Okay, so was it the same sort of deal?
Well, that was a slightly different one, but it was illegal.
But similar idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so, okay. I did not expect this was going to go this way. So how many people have you buried? It's just the two?
And then a bunch of ashes, but
Oh, yeah.
the only two bodies that I've hauled away.
Okay. Oh my gosh.
Which to me, law has nothing to do with it as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
Human law and natural law do not coincide on many fronts. But anyway, I drove down and I hooked up. I took Ed and Kat. She came with me, my wife. And we put Ed and Clark together on a plane, and Susie, and they flew down to Tucson. And I hooked up this tow bar that I gotten from John, who had been dead a good fight. He died in 1977. And pulled their truck down to Ed's and Clark's house west of Tucson. In those days, it wasn't in the city limits, and it was out in the desert. And then over the next 2 or 3 days, Clark and I were able to get Ed to undergo what they call a laparotomy, which is a bummer of an operation where it's like this. They make an incision like that, and then they fold down the top layer and look at the organs inside and see what's wrong in there. And there was no cancer. But they did discover what they called esophageal varices, which I'd never heard of, and neither Clark nor I paid much heed to it. We learned that Ed was okay. He wasn't going to die in 2 months of pancreatic cancer. And we started hooping and hollering and carrying on. And then it was revealed that the problem with this thing called esophageal varices, which is ostensibly related to alcoholism, and Ed was not an alcoholic. I mean, he would drink, but he didn't need it. He would drink every now and then. When he and I were together, we'd drink beer if we run in a river or something. But when he'd break up with a wife, say, when he broke up with one of his wives, he came by and drank a lot of hard alcohol. So who knows? But at any rate, as I understand it, and I may be wrong, the esophageal artery thromboses and a cluster of smaller veins. I don't know whether it's a vein or an artery, but at any rate, they were weak-walled and would hemorrhage. And that's eventually what got him. And he started having bleeds in 1984. Yeah. And so Kath and I rented our house out in Santa Fe and used the money to rent a house down in Tucson. And we spent that winter there and hung out with Ed a lot, just, trying to be there for him. And we had a lot of good conversations then, too. And then He finished Hey Duke Lives in 1989, early March 1989. And he called me up. He said, let's go camping. I just finished it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay. And it was too late to leave that day. So I said, I'll take off. I'll start driving tomorrow morning. And then we can take off. And how did that go? I got there, that's right. And I got there too late for us to go camping. We had a place we were going to camp that we'd never camped before. And in the middle of the night, I was sleeping. The way their house was, they had this house, and then down the hill, maybe up to 100 yards down the hill, toward the Oreo, was where Ed's writing cabin was. And that's where I was staying. And Clark came in the middle of the night, said, Jack, you got to get Ed to the hospital, he's bleeding. So we climbed in the car, and this was maybe 3:30 or 4 in the morning, and I was driving. The hospital was on the far side of town, on the east side of town. And at one point Ed said, stop, and I stopped. He said, let's just go out in the desert and get it over with. And I said, this is entirely your call. I'm here to do what you want to do. And he sat there and he thought about it, and he thought about, maybe I have a chance of surviving this one. He said, I've got 2 little kids. Let's go to the hospital. So I did. And he was in the hospital for a couple of days, and then I went in, and Clark and I went in together. And by this time, I think her folks had come down. Tom and Carolyn, her mother and dad. And he said to us, I'm not going to make it. I can tell I'm not going to make it this time. But there was an operation they could do, which would be called a portal shunt. And but that same night, he said, I got to get out of here. And so that's when I swiped the lady's wheelchair and wheeled him out of the hospital. And then I wanted to give them some space because
Have a family conversation.
Yeah.
A family care.
And I said, I'm going to go move into a motel so you guys have total space. And I didn't tell anybody which one. And he started to bleed again that night. And Clark was mightily PO'd at me the next morning because she couldn't get me to help him get to the hospital. So she called up Dave and Nancy, Dave Foreman.
Mm-hmm.
So they got him to the hospital. But Dave and Nancy were supposed to be on this. They were leaving the next day for another trip.
Mm-hmm.
And so got him into the hospital, and we had been told about this operation called a portal shunt, which would make an artificial, whatever it is, artery or vein between the esophagus and the liver.
Mm-hmm.
And that could save him. And so he finally agreed to have that operation, and they did it, and it was a success. But he was, by this time, having tubes pulled up and down his esophagus. He was bleeding, and there was no way they could stop it. And so that's when, by this time, Doug Peacock was also there. Mm-hmm. And so was Steve Prescott and Susan. Susan's Clark's sister. And it was Susan and Clark, Tom and Carolyn and Peacock and me. And I was getting blood illicitly with this blood type from a guy, and to keep him alive, just to keep stuff going in.
How did that work? Like,
Tripoli.
yeah, you just said it.
I said, I need blood, man. Give me some blood.
And he just.
And it was a guy who. I let him know it was necessary, and he knew it anyway. So I won't give his name.
Yeah, you know.
And so anyway, I was bringing over blood, and both Steve was an MD, and Peacock was a medic at Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, he went through some stuff, I'll tell you. I haven't seen Peacock in a long time, but I always felt that if it hit the fan big time, he and I knew we were okay back to back.
Right.
And
He's the guy you wanted in your foxhole. So
yeah, absolutely. But boy, anyway, I could tell it was on his way out. And so I would sit with him for hours, or Susie would. And the next morning, after days went by, a couple of days, I could hear in his breathing that he wasn't going to last long. But I said, I'll go get one more slug of blood. And I went off to the hospital to get it. And I called the house, and I talked to Susan, Clark's sister. She said, Jack, Ed just died. And so the day before, this sounds awful, but it's the way it goes, I stopped by an ice plant and asked if I could make sure that they had enough ice to keep 200 pounds of meat fresh for a couple of days. And so the first stop was the same doctor to get the blood. And I said, I don't need the blood. I need a death certificate. He said, I can't give you one of those. And I said, man, I need this death certificate.
We got to make this legit.
And
We got to get some paperwork here.
So on the way back with the death certificate, I picked up 200 pounds of dry ice. And we packed up it. Well, he was in a sleeping bag, and we put him in a body bag then and put ice around him to keep him fresh. And then we stashed him in the back of my pickup truck. And then I filled out the death certificate, and that was something you're not supposed to do unless you're an MD.
Right.
But I could tell he was dead, you know.
Yeah, you don't need
And so
to go to medical school to...
And so I knew, and Peacock had taken off. He needed to be alone for a little bit. And he came back. And so Peacock and Steve went in Peacock's car, and Tom, Clark's dad, and I climbed in my truck, and we had Ed in the back. And away we went.
And everyone was just like this is what was on the mission, I guess, so to speak. They knew Ed wanted this, and your group of 4 was there to execute on it.
Yeah, and then when Dave died, Foreman, a year ago last September, they were sounding me, how do you deal with stuff like this? Because I sort of became an authority on what you do.
Oh, right. Did they do something similar for him?
Well, he wanted himself just taken out in the wilderness somewhere.
Right.
Laid on top of the ground, let the animals consume him.
There's this whole other issue here around death and how, even it's commodified now.
Yeah, well, he ended up being, I said, you need at least 4 guys under 60 to do this, because it takes endurance to deal with carrying a body a long way from where you can park. I remember we had Ed sleeping in his sleeping bag, and we each had the corner. We had 2 shovels, and we had them on 2 shovels.
Right.
And that's the way
50 pounds each, basically.
Yeah.
Without the ice.
And away we went. And it takes a lot of chops, man. It really does. And then you got to dig the hole, and that was a whole trip into its own. And
while you're processing this emotional connection to
we
person.
We were on a mission.
Yeah. So you're just like,
yep. And
follow the plan.
And we did it. And we made a solemn vow that none of us would ever reveal where he was. And
Ed wanted that. Or I guess it has to be that way, right?
Yeah, I was imagining people wanting to dig up the body and taking his forefinger or something.
Right.
And
or making it an industrial tourist site.
Yeah, and he was illegally buried.
Right.
And but on public land. Anyway, it was done as best we could do, and we poured a bottle of tequila or something in the grave. Both Peacock and I got in the grave and tested it to make sure it was comfy. And I remember when I was laying in the grave, I saw two birds. I saw a turkey vulture and I saw a red-tailed hawk. And I looked at the vulture and said, not yet. You know, I've had this relationship with vultures.
Yeah.
There's a whole roost right across, and they're here in the summertime, about 200 yards from here. But at any rate, then we drove back, and we had gotten out in the nick of time because another friend of Ed's who had been told, they called and told him, I won't give his name, called the press.
Okay.
And we missed the press by about 10 minutes.
That would have been a mess.
And we were all just totally exhausted. Because I'd been awake for a week, and Peacock had been mostly awake for a week. He got there about 3 days after I did.
So what was going through your mind while you're driving down the road to this secret place with Ed in the back? Like, were you afraid you were going to get pulled over? Were you paranoid at all about?
Well,
or were you just focused?
I figured the way I had Ed's body in the back of the truck was under this. I built a bed frame with my sleeping mat on top of it, and there was about this much space beneath the bed, just enough to slide Ed under it. So they would really have to be looking for him.
Right.
But I had this death certificate, and I filled out another paper of transportation, all of which was totally illegal.
You're like, you had
But who cares, man? I mean,
yeah.
You're doing what your buddy wanted you to do. So we did. And
it sounds like you're trying to get the paperwork in line as best you could.
well, so that we did get stopped.
Yeah, to protect yourself.
But I didn't realize I was doing an illegal act by filling
yeah.
out and signing the death certificate.
I mean, you hadn't slept for a week. You got to give you,
But it was.
But I mean, did you have any idea when you made this promise 10 years before that it was all going to go down this way?
Well, I didn't know. I said to him at the time, "You're 9.5 years older than me, so I'm going to be doing all the work."
Yeah.
Well, you sail off into the sunset, and but it was cool because, I mean, we were friends, and really a great friend. Boy, anyway, we did it. Everybody was wasted. A week later, Clark, a bunch of us put together the first wake, I guess you'd call it, in Saguaro National Monument on the east side of Santa Fe, Tucson.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of fun, and I played taps, and that was the last time I ever played the trumpet in public.
It was it just kind of your way of.
Well, it was time. I mean, I figured what was I? I was in my early 50s by then, nearly 54. And to be a real jazz player needs heavy-duty endurance, the kind of jazz I like to play. And I just didn't, and if I couldn't play like that, I didn't want to.
Yeah, you didn't want to.
And I figured this is as good a place as any. So I did it. And I think we had some slow elk brought to us by Brother Peacock.
Yeah.
And Hoots was there. Hoots was Howard Abbey, Ed's brother, one of his brothers. And it was a really good one. There was another one in Moab, but I didn't go to that. But when I went back, 2014 was it? Yeah, I went back to spend some time with Wendell Berry back in Kentucky, because Wendell, Ken Kesey, Larry McMurtry, and Ed Abbey all took a course with Wallace Stegner in creative writing at the University in Santa Cruz, I think. is where that was. I'd have to read my book, but and Wendell had gone to the one in Moab because he really liked Abby a lot, and he read me. Boy, it was really neat. I've got it somewhere, the recording of it. I recorded Wendell reading Wallace Stegner's thing that he asked Wendell to read at that second Moab event. And it was really heartwarming. And boy, Wendell's still alive. I've got a bunch of his books. He became a friend. And his best friend is a guy named Wes Jackson, whom I mentioned earlier, who founded the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. But anyway, after that was over, it just, the people who were really good friends of Ed, we really knew each other. And there aren't many left. Steve Prescott died within the last 2 or 3 years. Tom Cartwright died within the last 10 years, I think. I have a photo, the 20th anniversary of the gang, the burial group that Clark took of us in Moab. And I don't know where that is anymore, but the only two left are Peacock and me. And I have to hand it to, his name escaped me. I like him very much. The guy who did the book Finding Abby.
Oh, Sean Curtis.
Yeah, who's a close, I guess, John Hustorfer's best friend.
Yeah.
And
both those guys are very influential to me.
And I liked him, and he had the super good taste to not ask me to tell him where Ed was buried.
Yeah.
And of course I didn't. But he found him. I know other people have. Because the only person I've taken out there is Clark, his widow. I figured that was appropriate.
Yeah.
And we got a rock because Ed wanted his headstone. So we got a piece of rock that was appropriate from that area. And we took it back to town and got it. Edward Paul Abbey, 1927, 1989, no comment.
No comment. And brought it back out.
Yeah.
I think, one of the other thing that's coming up for me just hearing you tell this story and going back to some of the other themes that have come up in the interview is this idea of trust. And now you have, not only was there's this piece of you, going way out of your way in a situation that wasn't reciprocal at this point. Like Ed could never pay you back.
Oh, you don't think like that.
And yet you're just doing this selflessly. And now you're, you have this secret you're carrying, to the end of your life of, this place of burial. And it's unique, and I find it fascinating, and I find it very beautiful because death is so
permanent.
It's permanent.
It's terminal.
It's the end for everybody. Everybody's gonna go. Everyone's gonna die. I'm gonna die. You're gonna die. My precious child's gonna die. Hopefully that happens long after I'm gone.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And yet, I think for so many people, they put it off because they're so afraid of it. And then it just like happens and there's no paperwork. And then they just kind of follow whatever traditional path is in line with their culture. And this is wildly different. I feel like, Ed knew what he wanted, how he wanted to be buried and have his ending, and then I see him as being very lucky to have you to help execute on it.
I don't see friends, real friends, do what they do.
Right, and maybe I don't. I wish I had more friends like Ed. You were to Ed in my life, and I don't. Maybe it's a generational thing. I can't think of anybody in my life who would do something like that for me. In this time period, in this milieu, to use your word. It's a hard thing.
Well, you know, people were going to done it with Dave Foreman.
Yeah.
And then I got to thinking, and I don't know to whom I sent this note, and I know it had to have nothing to do with the final outcome, but I remember that Dave had a bunch of screws in his back, and I had this vision of a coyote breaking a tooth on a screw. And I wrote this to somebody, but they finally, Dave, his second option was to be cremated and have his ashes mixed with Nancy's, because she died of Lou Gehrig's disease. She got that, which is a bummer. And but I frankly don't care. I mean, I figure when you're dead, that's that. And I'd thought about earlier on, when I still could hike, 15 miles a day, of having found the cave and hiking out with 5 gallons of water and just
Right.
Yeah, and but I didn't, and that's like when Ed died, man. I mean, there were a heck of a lot fewer of us on the planet than there are now.
Right.
And I never got a permit to run a river.
Yeah.
Ever.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah.
I would just run them.
Yeah.
And I got busted a couple of times. And one time I got busted and fined $100 for tearing down the sign that said, "Write down where you want to camp," on the San Juan. And the judge fined me $100 and said I would have done the same thing. He was an old guy like me.
Going back to consciousness real quick, do you think after you die, your consciousness will live on at all?
Who knows? I'm not concerned one way or the other.
Yeah, you're at peace.
I've always been at peace. I've never been a Christian. I've never have. I've got friends who are Buddhists, Zen Buddhists, and Gary Snyder's been one all his life. I've got my good friend Gary Nabhan is a Franciscan monk, married, but nonetheless he's a Franciscan. And everybody has their own way of dealing with it. I'm simply, the flow of nature will do whatever it does.
Right.
And that's exactly as it should be. Otherwise, boy, I think I'm really, like that photograph I showed you when you first got here, I'm really looking forward to all sorts of good stuff from the James Webb telescope.
Right.
I took a course in astronomy in college. That was one of the few that I really dug.
Yeah.
And anyway, I think that looking at a photograph wherein there are thousands of galaxies visible, some of them very minutely so, but nonetheless there. And ostensibly, from the point of view of the Webb telescope, the view through the hole was the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length.
Right.
And so that's what we're looking at in the night sky in that photograph.
Yeah, and it's still such a deep field.
Yeah, and there are thousands of galaxies in that grain of sand's worth of whatever you call it, aperture. And or at least that's what it said.
Yeah, sure.
And so whatever, I mean, that puts things in real perspective, man. I mean,
absolutely.
So I just am thankful to have gotten a crack at life, because I've tried to give it my best shot, and it's all you can do.
4 questions left, but I'm going to just end with one, and that's the advice for aspiring oral historians or historians. So for those interested in pursuing a career, and you could replace the word oral historian, but a career with a similar path to yours, where you're
Documentarian.
Yeah, documenting. You're documenting people's cultures
In perspectives.
in perspectives. What advice would you give them?
My favorite phrase from The Lord of the Rings is something that Gandalf said, which is, advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise. But prepare to have a wonderful time and take the best equipment you can afford and love it or don't even bother. You don't love doing it, there's no sense in doing it because it requires huge enthusiasm to pursue it. And
There's a lot of there's easier ways to make money.
yeah, there sure are. But it also takes you wherever you want to go. You think up a project. I was lucky, man. I only got turned down for 2 grants out of more than 2 dozen that I've gotten. And I found that my real education came through that and camping, getting out in it and doing what I call oral history and following subjects which are themselves fascinating to you. That to me is huge. I mean, I had never really gotten into Hispano folk music, but I heard it and I got off on it. And I ended up recording probably the biggest collection of Hispano folk songs, over 3,000 of them. And you just learn. Each project provides this whole sphere of reference. And so your own sphere of reference keeps getting bigger with all of these nodules of what you learn. And it's great that's how I got. It was through Ed. It was that winter that Kath and I moved down to Tucson and Pellegrina, our daughter, for the winter when Ed had his first bleed. And he acted as my listener, my editing listener to a series called Southwest Sound Collage that I produced. And he said, this should be a book. And he called up Harbinger House Press and they snapped it up. So Ed was because of Ed that I became a writer. But then I realized that articulating that which comes to you is important to do. And so writing books became great fun for me. I mean, I never wrote a book I didn't have fun. And so the whole thing becomes, but also be meticulous in how you archive your work and then stick it someplace where you think it's probably as good a place to be as ever. I stuck with the Museum of New Mexico because I've done a bunch of projects through them. And I used to work for Folk Art, the Laboratory of Anthropology, and History Museum. And had a really good feeling for it. So it's there. And it's digitized, bearing in mind that the first 20 some odd years of my working with recording was on 30 some odd years was on tape. And when I'd make radio programs, I'd do my mixing in a 4-channel reel-to-reel analog tape recorder.
Right.
And I cut an awful lot of tape. I became an expert. And especially important when you were splicing tape in, say, an oboe concerto, if you have to cut out a mistake and fill in something else, when you're splicing tape, it's a heck of a lot trickier than it is on Pro Tools.
Oh my gosh. You can just like, yeah.
But get your best equipment and then teach yourself. Don't be taught. It's best to learn. I've learned that teaching myself everything has been the only way I'd get it. It's probably a complete screw up in my brain work somehow.
Do you think you have like a learning disability or something, or just is that your philosophy of spirit?
I was only interested in things that fascinated me.
Yeah.
I mean, fascinated with astronomy in college, and definitely not fascinated at all with algebra.
There you go. I think that kind of goes back to what you were speaking to, like follow the fun, follow your bliss.
And I realized, well, frankly, what happened was I was going to college in a Presbyterian college back east. I will not give the name, although it's probably known, but I was expelled from a Bible class that was mandatory for preferring the Bhagavad Gita to the Bible. And I figured I'm out of here.
yeah, I could see. No, that'd be too much for.
So anyway, and I want to say this too. I've never had a career. I've had a life.
Yeah.
And that's really important to me. And I'm not the first person to say that. My friend Richard Mahler, who also produced radio programs, first said that, and I thought he and I shared a perspective on this. But live your life as hard as you can and document as much of it as you want to. And that's it. And then treat it well,
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting me interview you.
Oh, this has been my pleasure.
Sharing your story through, the stories from your new book and, kind of your philosophy on life and your relationships with Ed and the other environmentalists and environmental writers that.
I didn't talk much about Gary, but I really have. Gary Snyder. His brain is beautiful. Actually, one thing that he and I did, we were part of a group of us who went to the first UN conference on the human environment in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972.
Oh, wow.
And Gary and Kath and I had the same pad in this apartment, and we rented a gallery. It took 4 Hopis, 2 Navajos, 1 Chicano. And actually, to me, that whole thing was a bust, but we had rented a gallery there, and it turned into Third World Central.
Oh, wow.
And so for weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, I've forgotten how long, every night, it was just amazing. And all of these people from great big tall people from Africa and, Eskimos, and and they connected with each other. From my perspective, that was great because all of those third world indigenous peoples recognized the common theme, and it was incredible. Also, Margaret Mead, she was there. And she was in one of the back galleries of the corner of the gallery, and she was sitting there with the assistant chief of Stockholm police, and they were getting stoned.
That's hilarious.
Did my heart good,
Yeah, I guess they never had a prohibition in that country.
But it was, it's trying to get perspectives, especially of people whose perspectives may disappear soon, but who have great contributions to make to what I think of as the commons of human consciousness, because I see that as our greatest commons, other than the universe itself. But from the human point of view, our collective system of attitudes is radically askew and getting ever more so, even more than when Ed was writing his books or anything I've ever done. It's getting weirder by the day. It's dichotomized, our culture's dichotomized, and we have to find common threads to bring us back into some sort of intuitive relationship with a planet that spawned us
Mm-hmm.
because we belong to it. It doesn't belong to us. That's, I've sort of rambled on and on, man, but
Well, I appreciate
that's the stuff
you're sharing your perspective and your truth.
it's the way it is. I'll show you a
Yeah.
picture of me living in a hogan.
Yeah, do it.